Back when these earliest Marvel movies were being released, I don't think I even had my license to drive. Any movies I saw on our single-screen small-town theater were largely determined by what my parents were willing to also see themselves. I saw Iron Man for the first time at home and saw The Incredible Hulk in theaters, I think mostly because my parents recognized that character. I don't even think I was paying enough attention to headlines to realize these two movies would end up being connected. By the time I first heard of Thor, I was aware that they were building to this team-up movie, and there was this new air of curiosity as to what the heck Marvel was planning with this shared universe. But that intrigue was counteracted by this being the Norse god of thunder, who sounded like the silliest character of all time. Like, how could they somehow mesh together a mythological character alongside Black Widow? Captain America seemed like a dork to me, but he at least felt like he belonged in the same world. I mean, they're both literally from Earth, but I just couldn't see it all coming together. I remember having a laugh about it with friends, thinking it was impossible to make a character like Thor work on screen. It felt more obvious here than with any other character that Marvel Studios was stuck working with their bottom-of-the-barrel characters to build this franchise. You don't have any Spider-Man, no X-Men, and suddenly we're stuck with Thor. Yet, on one random, bored weekend afternoon, I went into town with my brother to check this out, thinking if nothing else, it'd be worth a laugh. To this day, I think it's miraculous that they made a remotely watchable movie. It maybe doesn't hold up all that well, but the first movie has a lot of spectacle, and Hemsworth was an unexpected delight. This has been the trilogy Marvel has experimented with the most, never really nailing down a consistent tone or direction. Kenneth Branagh and Alan Taylor both had their own interpretations, both took the character in very different directions, and neither one was all that well received. And we had newcomers to the franchise like James Gunn walking so that an oddball like Taika Waititi could run. I think the relative failures of the first two movies probably taught Marvel the wrong lessons, that they needed to play things more safe. When really what they should have been learning is how important it is to find the right director for the job and to kinda get out of their way. It's hard to really get into that without talking about the entirety of the franchise, so instead I'll just focus on how odd this Thor trilogy is. The first movie is this royal family drama mixed with small-town comedy. Then we have this studio-meddled mess of dark and serious themes. And finally, a bright and unapologetic comedy. It's all over the map. Yet with Thor having exciting turns in the Avengers movies and Ragnarok being a slam dunk critical and financial success, we now have this character positioned to not only be the first ever MCU character to get a fourth movie, but now also a fifth. I don't think anyone would have expected Thor to have the highest staying power out of that original Avengers lineup. Going into this rewatch, I suspect that Thor 1 and 2 are worse than I remember because I barely remember them. Thor 1 stands out in my mind more than the sequel, likely just from seeing it a few more times over the years, but the lack of memorable qualities for either of those does not bode well. I'm actually fairly confident I skipped over them for my Infinity War rewatch, so I'm going into those movies with my lowest expectations and freshest eyes of the 9 movies so far. I've definitely seen Ragnarok more often and more recently. I enjoy the hell out of that movie, I already know that. But I am curious trying to take in the context of this entire saga. Is the movie too out of whack? Does it mesh together with the other movies at all? Both the Thor movies and the entire franchise. Do I love it as a wacky space comedy, or do I love it as a Marvel movie? I don't know, I got a lot of questions brewing on that one, and the only way to know is to move forward with these reviews, starting with Thor releasing back in 2011. And when looking at this first movie, I think the only logical place to start is with Thor's eyebrows. I hate them, you hate them. I'm not exaggerating when I say I think this movie would be like 10% better without the overtly blonde facial hair. It's just bad. With that out of the way, we can talk about the actual movie. The challenge Thor sets for itself was to introduce us to Asgard in a context where we could get on board with the fact that these Norse gods are in fact real. Then bringing that down to Earth so that Thor and Loki could be positioned for the events of the Avengers. That is an insanely tall order, and I think the general idea of Thor nearly starting a war and being cast out of Asgard was a great approach. That storyline accomplishes everything that this movie needed to. It even pulled that little magic trick of giving us an origin story for an already old and powerful character by putting him in a position to actually prove he's worthy of Mjolnir and his powers. The first act of this movie is this royal family drama in space. The second is a fish out of water comedy, and the movie wraps up with the few things happening that kind of attempt to bridge those two other elements. That's a lot to accomplish at the end of the movie there, but on paper, I really like the sounds of all that. It's no wonder I came out of this movie fairly impressed back in the day. The expectations were very low. As a movie-going, comic book-loving audience, we had movies like The Dark Knight and Iron Man showing us what this genre could become. But we also would have pretty recently been coming off of movies like X-Men The Last Stand, Origins Wolverine, and complete dumpster fires like Jonah Hex, which I've actually still never seen at this point. We were accustomed to comic book movies being kind of 50-50 in quality. Every time you went to see one of these, you didn't really know which side of the scale it would fall on. It's a fairly recent phenomenon for the bar to be as high as it is. But now we're weighing it against 20-some other Marvel movies, as well as kind of what the genre has become at large. And taking that into consideration, the end result is a fairly average comic book movie. It opens with Jane and her team chasing atmospheric anomalies, leading to them finding Thor. But that's just a cold open. We then get a proper beginning with the absolutely mesmerizing Anthony Hopkins narrating this fairly epic opening, detailing a 1,000-year-old war being fought in Norway between Asgard and the Frost Giants, then defeating them and claiming their casket of ancient winters. It's a pretty cool concept for this to have been a real thing fought on Earth, and establishing why ancient cultures would have come to believe these gods were real. It's because they actually met them. They literally watched Odin out there beating up frost giants. It has this high-key Lord of the Rings fantasy vibe that I'm pretty into. If you guys didn't know, I really like the Lord of the Rings movies. Hopkins could make narrating a puddle drying sound engaging. So, I may be a little blinded because of that, but I think this opening is very cool. We then get a look at the entirely CGI Golden City of Asgard, which maybe has aged some. Specifically, this tiered golden pyramid thing. But I think the rest of it mostly still looks great. And honestly, I'm kind of blown away by how good everything in and around Asgard looks. Nearly every shot with all the gold, rainbows, stars, and whimsical space scenery is actually quite gorgeous. They absolutely nailed that. Look at the spectacle of them riding off from Asgard down the Rainbow Bridge. This commitment to the color and majesty of it looks better than 95% of Marvel movies. It's wild that in the early days they allowed directors to leave their mark like this, and it's taken up until rather recently to get back to that. Although one good thing about taking away directors' freedom and pushing more towards a house style is that we don't get bombarded with Dutch angles like this. Seriously, what was Branagh doing? Every fourth shot in this movie is tilted like this. Sometimes there will be 3 back-to-back shots in this movie that are on a tilt. Everything from dialogue scenes to establishing shots. It makes it seem like he's never directed a movie before. Once you see it, it cannot be unseen. He uses it constantly. This man set a record this year for having most individual Oscar nominations in a year, including Best Director. He's not doing it because he's an idiot. It was a choice he made. It was just a bad choice. Looking back at the movie again, because it's frustrating. The Dutch angles are frustrating.
It's frustrating. It's frustrating. It's frustrating. It's frustrating.
Everything looks so grand and impressive that Thor and Odin's wing helms actually feel right at home. And the elaborate helmets of those two even make Loki's horn helm feel less ridiculous. Thor's helmet in particular is so great. I can't believe we only really got this full-on comic accurate look for like one scene in the entire franchise. They are holding a ceremony for Thor, preparing him to ascend as the next king of Asgard. The ceremony is interrupted by frost giants attempting to steal back their casket. I very stupidly, for a long time, thought this thing was the Tesseract. I don't know when I got that mixed up, but I forgot that this movie has its own unique ancient glowing blue box. It's just not a very distinct design, I guess. And they are quickly and easily wrecked by the destroyer. I love the calm and measured reaction from Hopkins. I believe this guy is thousands of years old when he speaks up. He's so collected, understanding, and just exudes wisdom. I guess they probably convinced him to take this role because he's only in like 4 scenes. He was just cashing fat checks in every scene where he's lying down asleep on a table. But his presence as Odin just adds so much credibility to this movie. Thor's throwing a little tantrum.
As king of Asgard.
But you're not king! Not yet.
And you're left with this impression that this man hasn't raised his voice in decades. It shuts Thor down so effectively. I'm just in awe of what a powerhouse actor Hopkins is. I'll have to force myself to move on from that talking point. The crazy thing is, this movie also managed to pick up Renee Russo to play Frigga, and they do nothing with her. You'll see her appear in many scenes, but her dialogue boils down to, "I am a mother. I love my sons." She's an incredible actress, and it's a damn shame they didn't really give her anything to do. Loki subtly tempts Thor to storm Jotunheim in retaliation, and Thor rallies his friends to come with him. All the dialogue here is pointing towards these being Thor's longest and oldest friends and all the adventures they've gone on together, and we don't know anything about these people, they never matter. It's fun seeing Hemsworth ham it up with this grand Shakespearean dialogue and delivery. I think you can tell he is the least experienced with this sort of theatrical performance, but it sort of works for this slightly more hard-headed character that he's not quite as formal as the others around him. Idris Elba somehow landed in the minor role of Heimdall. It's a bit part, but he's so badass in the role. His costume, voice, eyes, it's all perfect. But I'm not surprised he didn't really enjoy playing the character in these first 2 movies. I think he said he was mostly there to cut a check. Who's to blame him? He doesn't really do much. And while we're here, I was sort of impressed by the effects of the Bifrost. I assumed that CGI would have aged worse than it has. I'm not confident there's really any overtly bad CGI anywhere in this movie. When they arrive on Jotunheim, I think they do a good job of showing the scale of Laufey, king of the frost giants. I like his dismissive attitude, recognizing Thor is being an impudent brat. Thor is fully ready to leave, but there is a great beat after Laufey calls him a princess, where everyone just collectively exhales, knowing there's no going back. It's also a strong character moment to show how immature Thor still is. He's clearly not ready for the throne if he can be so easily cajoled into coming here and attacks after one tiny insult. Fighting is kind of his solution to everything. And once the fighting starts, Thor starts mocking their roars and is showboating throughout. He's so confident and arrogant. There's a weird lack of frost powers on display here, but there is some cool hammer action, and at least one explosive thunderbolt moment. These movies kind of don't have enough of that. Thor causes so much damage and presumably kills like 100 frost giants. He even blasts through the face of this big creature. That was probably someone's dog, dude. It's gross, but neat. I could have watched a full movie set in these cool space locations and weird planets, but I get why we couldn't have that. Odin puts a stop to it, with him and Laufey having this immediate understanding. Okay, I guess I wasn't done praising Hopkins.
You are a vain, greedy, cruel boy!
And you are an old man and a fool!
I never want to disappoint Sir Anthony. He's so good at hitting the emotional highs and lows. You can hear his voice catch at the very end as he carries out his sentence. I think it's effectively dramatic as Thor's armor is stripped away and he is cast out. We've now had 30 minutes of this family drama and a brewing war. It's a great first act overall. And now it comes literally crashing down to meet up with the opening, changing gears pretty hard to a wacky small town comedy. As I mentioned early in the video, growing up in a small town, this is kind of special for me, just seeing one of these movies set in something that's vaguely familiar. No, I didn't live in a desert, but it is interesting to see the God of Thunder just kind of strolling through these quiet streets filled with one-story buildings. I don't know if I've ever really seen that in another superhero movie, so it's just appreciated, I guess. It's just kind of a nice background. It doesn't really add a lot to the movie for me, just a few warm, fuzzy feelings.
You alright?
Hammer? Hammer?
Yeah, we can tell you're hammered. It's pretty obvious.
Kat Dennings cracks me up. She has such a unique blend of snarky, offbeat, deadpan comedy with her whole hint of goth vibe, while still somehow superseding many quirky girl tropes. I think she's delightful, and Marvel should feel quite lucky to have her. Forgive this tangent. There was a rumor that Marvel was creating a series with Randall Park. The idea was to have kind of a silly superhero X-Files. If they do make that and pair him off with Kat Dennings after they both appeared in WandaVision, I think it'll be a guaranteed hit. Anyways, it's a great little gag that Thor, the God of Thunder, gets taken down by a taser. Now, I referred to this section of the movie as fish out of water comedy, and that's kind of true, but they really don't get a lot of mileage out of that. Nowhere near as much as they could or probably should have. Thor smashes that cup on the floor, that still gets a laugh out of me, walks out in the middle of traffic, and goes to a pet store to ask for a horse. That's about it. I remembered it being a very prominent part of the movie. There's just as much slapstick here as there is any sort of fish out of water jokes. Like, after he crushes some doctors, he smushes his face on the window, he gets hit by a truck twice, which is funny the second time, and it probably should have been rounded out with a third. It's kind of strange that it isn't. And I think there are some great lines and comedic beats sprinkled in throughout. Like after Eric busts Thor out of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s holding.
Dr. Selvig, just keep him away from the bars. I will.
Where are we going? To get a drink.
And then at that bar, they accidentally engage in this little chugging standoff where neither wants to be the first to put their mug down. And both...
What happened?
We drank, we fought, he made his ancestors proud.
And Stellan's line shortly after...
I still don't think you're the God of Thunder. But you ought to be.
all crack me up. Maybe I'm easy to please, but overall, there's a good mix of comedic styles that largely work because they're rooted in the characters. Hemsworth has so much confidence, charm, and really exceptional timing. It's funny to realize that humor was so important to the character in his first outing, and never really came back into play until Ragnarok. So among his 3 movies, The Dark World is potentially more out of place than Ragnarok. I won't die on that hill, but it felt worth mentioning. It's not as dramatic of a new direction for the character as it seemed. It's just that the style of humor is different than what was seen in the first movie. Also, Hemsworth is already freakishly massive in this movie. Like, if you did a lineup of all the shirtless scenes of all the many superhero movies over the years, I want to say that, like, Henry Cavill and maybe even Ben Affleck's Batman are, like, the only ones who even come close. And he legitimately just gets bigger and bulkier with each movie. I think Thor and Jane's dynamic is cute, but I'm not certain their relationship is very well established. Thor kisses her hand, which is charming, but just about the only screen time they share is them driving out to the site of the hammer together, and Jane spends the whole ride worrying that he might be a crazy person. Spoilers, based on evidence you've been given, yeah, absolutely you should think he's a crazy person. Eric comments that he's noticed the way Jane looks at Thor, but we never really see that longing grow or play out. It's just a couple of hot people ogling each other. And come on, Eric, did you see the gratuitous shirtless scene? Of course she was gonna look. Natalie Portman was probably my #1 celebrity crush when this movie came out. I thought she was so cool and super badass. It's funny to realize she plays this role like such a mega awkward geek. I kinda love it. So now I feel like she's still a celebrity crush, but for totally different reasons. But this movie does nothing to build their relationship, and I have zero investment in it. Maybe that's just me hating the trope of the newcomer falling in love with the first person they meet. It worked slightly better in something like Wonder Woman, but it usually just feels like a circumstantial obligation and rarely like that romance was meant to be. Someday I'll do a Wonder Woman review, and I'll have to compare the fact that both movies have a first act taking place somewhere we've never seen, this fantastical other world, and then a fish out of water comedy where they fall in love with the first person they meet. The movies have a lot in common between them. In Thor, I think they try to play this relationship off as like destiny. It's just such a strange coincidence that Thor landed next to one of only a few people on Earth who would even be open to understanding any of this. But they never address that in the movie. However, they did fully sell me on Jane being a researcher because she uses one of those clicky 4-colored pens. Very believable. I'm not even joking. I don't know a single person who works in research who doesn't own like 6 of these. While Thor is navigating life on Earth, we have various cutaways, like a bunch of rednecks trying to lift the hammer. Oh, I've always loved the hum of the hammer. That's such instantly iconic sound design, and it's persisted from this very first movie. It's reached a point where I'm kind of just like, yeah, of course, that's what Mjolnir sounds like. It's wild to think of someone creating that sound. I think it's kind of on the level of association as like a lightsaber. Anyways, it's so funny that these hillbillies turned it into a tailgate party and a contest. Stan Lee makes his cameo here, ripping out the bed of his truck, and we get the payoff of that post-credit scene with Coulson arriving. It's not even like built upon, it's exactly as we saw it in that post-credit scene. I guess this was at a time before they would film things uniquely to use as a teaser. How did I forget Coulson is in so many of these early movies? In my mind, he was in like one of these and then the Avengers. No wonder it was so devastating when he was killed off in that movie. It took rewatching everything so close together to fully appreciate that. Back on Asgard, we learn Loki ratted out Thor and friends about going to Jotunheim so Odin would come save them. But they also realize Loki likely let the frost giants in to begin with, and it was his plan for them to then go to Jotunheim. At this point, he's just a chaos agent, not outright evil. And building off a tease from earlier in the movie on Jotunheim, Loki now learns he is a frost giant. It's implied he was a runt, so he's no giant. And I'll mention it just the once here, but it annoys me that this entire plot point of him being a frost giant is just like never addressed again. It's super unimportant to the character. I think he uses frost powers once in this movie, but it's so strange how it sends him spiraling to learn this information, and it just never matters again. I guess he just got over it. He even refers to himself in this movie as the son of Odin after learning that information when he's double-crossing Laufey. So he doesn't care that much at all, and still obviously feels more personally connected and loyal to Asgard. In general though, Hiddleston is incredible in this movie. He really was born for this role and manages to stand out in scenes alongside big names like Hopkins. He acted so hard here that poor little Odin has to lay down and take a big nap. But seriously, his delivery, slinky movements, toothy grin, he's so good in the role, and it's rather comical to remember Hiddleston originally auditioned to play Thor. Wen D. Johnson handles the majority of the editing for these superhero movie reviews. He does fantastic work, by the way, and has his own channel that's very underrated. There are links to that in the description, as well as a little card in the corner here. I would ask that you please go check that out. He deserves that extra bit of support. He does incredible work. But he also handled the editing on my Star Wars video. That was very much about how a Thrawn trilogy would be a great addition to that series. And he and I shared a laugh over the fact that when Loki kind of changes into a frost giant, he looks exactly like Thrawn. Just a fun little connection there. Loki steps into the throne, and Thor's friends immediately get sketchy vibes from him. As they should. He really starts to lean into some pretty major evil vibes. How could they not be suspicious after that interaction? S.H.I.E.L.D. takes all of Jane's research and annoyingly does nothing to really reassure her. Claiming we're the good guys isn't very helpful. Like, if you're the good guys, then maybe give her a little bit of peace of mind. But I do like the connection that Selvig knows them because he's apparently pals with Banner. That's a little fun way to tie that together. We even have Sitwell in this movie again, although extremely briefly. And there's one last larger MCU connection I quite liked. When the Destroyer arrives on Earth,
Is that Not one of Stark's?
I don't know. Guy never tells me anything.
Thor fights his way to his hammer, and we get the only pre-Avengers appearance of Hawkeye. Renner was hot off the Hurt Locker and the town. He was a rising star with upcoming appearances in the new Mission Impossible and Bourne movies at this time. So it can feel like he was cast just for his name alone, but just listen to his first line.
You want me to slow him down, sir? Or are you sending in more guys for him to beat up?
And he has another funny one right after that.
Better call it, Coulson. I'm starting to root for this guy.
Whoever recognized that this dramatic actor would be at home in these movies deserves a medal. But it's actually hilarious that he doesn't do anything. It's like someone forgot really late in their planning committee that they should probably attempt to introduce him ahead of the Avengers. I get a little kick out of Thor's quick line.
You're big. Fought bigger.
He's just as cocky and arrogant as he's ever been. The moment when he can't lift the hammer is a major turning point. For the first time, this god is powerless and unable to punch his way out of something. He comes to learn the extent of his fall from Asgard. Having him learn some humility is a great starting point for this character. It's okay for our heroes to be a little cocky, it's like the whole thing with Iron Man. But if he's destined to one day be king, he kinda has to balance that out a bit more. Although it's a little rushed that this 1500-year-old god learns this lesson in like 2 days. It's like a tantrum-throwing 5-year-old having their toy taken away for 9 hours and learning their lesson forever. That's the proportional scale of time Thor is experiencing here. I did the math. I think this movie could have benefited from a time jump of a couple months at least, where Thor actually resigns himself to a mortal life and makes Earth his home, which would have also allowed the relationship with Jane to build more naturally. It's a great change to see one of these movies set in a small town, but that setting doesn't add much within this movie. Again, through a small time skip, we could have shown Thor go from Asgardian prince to a small town farmhand or something simple like that. That 180 would have been so fun to see play out. When Thor's being held by S.H.I.E.L.D., Loki appears to tell him that Odin is dead. When Thor asks if he can come home, he sounds like a scared little kid. And after that, Thor even thanks Loki for telling him, accepting his fate. There's clearly a lot of trust there still. I love that Loki casually tries to snag the hammer on the way out. He strains for a moment, then just strolls away, trying to play it off all aloof and cool. We already suspect Loki let in the frost giants, but learn his reasoning was just to ruin Thor's big day. Obviously, he had some resentments, but it's quite tragic that he just wanted to be Thor's equal and allowed it to go down such a dark path. Suddenly, he's conspiring to murder Odin, but that was of course another ploy. It makes so much more sense to me long term with the character's redemption that he was essentially playing the bad guy. It's like he had a rebellious teenage phase at the ripe old age of 1000, resulting in the deaths of just as many. I love the scene with Heimdall, where the realization of Loki being in charge really crystallizes for him. He looks terrified and just beat down. And it's even better later on when he's fired and immediately attacks Loki. Heimdall's so badass and admirable for his duty-bound rigidity, but then he's instead bound by this frozen rigidity. Don't worry though, he just kind of flexes his way out of that. And speaking of flexing, he flexes his own rules when Thor's 4 friends conspire to rescue him. I'll stop trying to make mini logic leaps to connect every point. I don't know why I got wrapped up in that little game I set for myself. Once on Earth, it's pretty funny watching them just walk through these quiet streets. But oh man, this is some atrocious music. It seems like a lot of people like the soundtrack of this movie, but I think the score is incredibly hit and miss. And that musical sting when they poke their heads through the cafe window is the worst thing I've ever heard. They might as well have played some tuba. Or even a slide whistle. either of those would have been more dramatic and well suited than the actual score. It's like they forgot to replace the temp music. While I'm talking score, I appreciate the efforts of the soundtrack in this movie to blend tones of fantasy, sci-fi, drama, royalty, and heroic cues, while also needing to root it back to Earth. That's a lot of boxes to tick, but I think it misses more often than it hits. Pretty well, none of it was memorable to me, and the few good tracks in the score are overshadowed by some incredibly dull and questionable ones. Loki sends the destroyer to Earth, which was wisely established beforehand, and there is this awesome shot of it pinning Volstagg and Lady Sif attacking it from overhead. I think it's just a bold angle that shows the action incredibly well, and I really like when this thing twists and warps around after to face her. But really, all these four accomplished is telling Thor that Odin is alive, then getting their ass kicked. These characters exist in such a strange background realm where we're continually told they're important and they're Thor's oldest friends, yet they are irrelevant to every movie. Thor gets backhanded in the brain, as a mortal, mind you. He probably should have died instantly. But that sacrifice leads to him once again being worthy. The way his armor is reassembling around him is awesome, but I think they take the weight out of it by instead cutting to like 6 different reaction shots of everyone else. That could have easily been like a 60-second long scene like Prince Adam turning into He-Man, and I'd have loved every second. Instead, the camera spends all its time in other places they were probably trying to save on their CGI budget. However, I still love Thor calling Coulson son of Cole. It's just kind of a perfect line. Loki shoots the Bifrost straight at Jotunheim, which is insane. I don't know why this device is capable of destroying planets when it's mostly just meant as a means of travel, but it really drives home that Loki feels no connection to what are technically his people. It also doesn't really make any sense that the people on Earth can see this happening. Did we really need to cut away to them here? Their role in this movie has pretty well concluded. Loki and Thor argue it out, and it's Hiddleston's best scene, after already being a scene stealer throughout. He legitimately elevates this movie so much, but their actual fight is a little lacking. The best part is the last 30 seconds where Loki creates a bunch of illusions and Thor lightnings them away before resting his hammer on Loki's chest, but the hand-to-hand stuff before that was pretty messy. Having Thor fight a mini-boss and then a little scrap with his brother is a perfectly fine third act. In fact, I respect that they didn't try to make their first space movie into some universe-level threat. The bar is quite low, but it's probably the best third act of the 4 Phase 1 origin movies. Thor destroying the bridge completes his arc, saving Jotunheim and using his powers selflessly. It's simple but effective. Loki pleading with Odin at the end cements this character as being so layered and brilliantly acted. It's a shame that him drifting off into space looks so crappy. It really sucks all the emotion out of that scene. Loki's journey in this movie is super unique. He's a trickster who starts out trying to mess with his brother, but once he learns his life is a lie and that he is literally the son of the enemy, he believes he must be the villain and chooses to play that role. He didn't put Odin into supernap mode, so he has no real blame there, and when he holds the throne, he's not wrong for keeping Thor in exile. Odin made that choice for a reason, and undoing it would literally start a war. Loki's so much more than the villain of this movie, and it's interesting to realize the Avengers is probably the only time he does fully inhabit that role. He often gets quoted as being one of Marvel's #1 villains, but rather, I think he's one of their #1 characters, who happened to be a villain in one movie. It's kind of like how Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator in Terminator 1 and 2 has appeared on lists of both the greatest of all time heroes and villains. In our epilogue, Thor is a sad boy because Loki and Jane are gone. We learn she now works for S.H.I.E.L.D. and is looking for Thor, and Odin is real proud of his son. The animated credits are neat in that it's just some cool visuals soaring through space. It's likely nothing you haven't seen before. It's straight up comical that Foo Fighters' Walk plays over the end credits. It's a great song, but I think it's here exclusively because it was popular at the time. It got an unintentional laugh out of me hearing that needle drop at the very end here. And the post-credit scene is a simple tease with Nick Fury. We learn that Jane has a theory named after her now, and Selvig will be working with the Tesseract. And of course, that Loki is still in play. I actually don't have a list of stray points to dump at the end for once. I covered the movie pretty thoroughly already, and Thor 1 is fine. I would use words like serviceable. Good, not great. I think it's probably more than anyone, certainly myself, expected from this character and movie, especially the way Marvel tied their own hands needing to introduce Thor and Asgard while bringing them to Earth and setting up the main threat of the Avengers. I'll reiterate, it's a tall order to fill, so having an extra generic hero's journey gets the job done while tackling some other major setup that was needed. It's generally more boring than I remembered, not a lot happens. Overall, it's not as strong as I remembered, dropping from about a 7 to a 6, so not a steep fall. It's just not a very memorable movie. I kind of like that the focus is on Thor becoming worthy rather than non-stop action or incredibly high stakes, but I still think they could have balanced that out better. Thor's friends shouldn't even be in the movie if they're going to do so little with them, and we could have instead reallocated that time to having Thor and Jane develop their relationship further. There's great casting all around, for the Asgardians especially, right down to Idris Elba. Hopkins and Hiddleston do a lot of heavy lifting in this movie, although Hemsworth is still great in the role. Asgard looks phenomenal, but good god, the Dutch angles are distracting. I almost want to knock another point off this movie for that alone. Like, it's super distracting. But it's balanced out by things looking good otherwise, so I don't know, I'm gonna leave that alone. I like that Branagh brought his Shakespearean background, adding some gravitas to these silly characters. It makes a lot of sense why he was brought on to direct a movie like this. But it's pretty well the most mid-Marvel movie so far. If asked, I would say I like it. It's good for a few decent laughs. It's a crowd pleaser that falls a bit below the bar of excellence Marvel has largely set. Kicking off the first of my non-MCU interludes is The Cabin in the Woods. Hold up, horror haters, give me a minute to win you over. In these segments, I pick someone involved with the production at hand as a jumping off point to recommend another movie, and give a brief reprieve from nearly 3 hours of straight superhero talk. Here, linking up films through Chris Hemsworth. And while it released after the first Thor, Cabin in the Woods was actually filmed first. He was still a star on the rise who wasn't really known at all. But this movie seized on his obvious charm and leading man good looks to do some really fun twists on common horror tropes. And as another broad MCU connection, this was actually co-written by Joss Whedon with the other writer, Drew Goddard, serving as director. This movie is paradoxically effective for both horror lovers and haters. It's satirizing all sorts of horror genres and tropes that horror fans will enjoy and haters may enjoy seeing lambasted. If you normally avoid scary movies, there's still a very high chance you'll be familiar with these tropes simply through cultural osmosis. Even the name directly calls attention to the well-known trope of a bunch of hot young adults venturing alone to a cabin in the woods. So a lot of what you need to know to be in on the joke is relatively surface level. And the film's comedic nature means you won't be scared and stressed out for 90 straight minutes. The movie has a fair bit of gore, but it's not especially scary. I don't want to spoil too much, as these strange and surprising meta elements are best experienced for themselves. I watched this at a time where I hadn't yet fully desensitized myself into being able to more easily watch horror, and I still had a great time here. The characters are likable, the pacing is excellent, the laughs are abundant, yet there's enough real horror on display that horror haters might actually find a nice entry point that's often very difficult to seek out when you scare easily like I did. This one isn't realistic or existential in a way that will keep you up at night looking under your bed. My hope is that this more fun and humorous presentation throughout will open newcomers up to the idea that not all horror is trying to scare you to death. Go into it with an open mind, and if you do check it out, please let me know. Onward to 2013, Thor: The Dark World. Can I just not? Can I skip this movie? Nobody would even notice if I just gave this movie a 2 and skipped over this section, right? Honestly, I am rather curious to revisit it. I think I saw it once in theaters and again a couple years after that. Basically, what I remember is whatever scenes were revisited in Endgame, something with a floating van in a warehouse, and that the Aether is a red goo that infects Jane. Also that the end teleporting fight is a cool idea, handled poorly, with Christopher Eccleston being totally wasted as the villain. Those are the things that stand out in my mind. The rest of this movie has completely left my brain over the years. I feel like it's pretty infamously considered the worst Infinity Saga Marvel movie, with the only others usually in that debate being Iron Man 2 and The Incredible Hulk. And having now rewatched it, I don't get all the hate. Is it a secret hidden gem like I found Iron Man 3 to be? No, not really. I think it was precisely as good as the first Thor, which is a testament to the general quality of this franchise. The low bar for these movies is fairly high still, but the whole movie is 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. They tried loads of new things with mixed results, and were pretty haphazard about what pieces of the tone and themes of the first movie they kept or stripped away. I saw someone refer to Thor 1 Thor as Golden Retriever Thor. He's just this blonde, happy lad bouncing around, flashing his smile, and generally being a good boy. I kind of liked that aspect of the character. But there is absolutely room for more serious, dour tones in this series. It potentially just veered too hard in that direction here, even before shit hits the fan. I'm torn on it, because showing him be more contemplative and mature is good character development, growing into Odin's role of the wise king of Asgard. But they also fail to stick the landing on that aspect. Alan Taylor was hired to direct after some recent work on Game of Thrones, and you can tell he tried to take this character and world more seriously. And I'm sure that's what Marvel hired him for, but it seems like they never quite got on the same page, and the end result has very mismatched tones of a moody drama and wacky space adventure. One of the worst things this movie did was center everything around Jane and Thor's romance. After questioning this with the first movie, they are now definitely treating this like it's some grand love that reaches beyond time and space, when really it was always just that Jane had a crush on this hunky alien she spent 3 days with, and they seemed to get along and share some interests. But her priority had always clearly remained her career. That was present throughout the first movie, and we see it again in her first scene of the Dark World. She's nervous on her date because she hasn't quite gotten over Thor, even though it's been 2 years, but she's now willing to put herself through an awkward first date, so at least she's trying. But the second Darcy shows up with news about work, she's willing to throw it away to investigate that instead. While that's quite rude, her commitment to her own life and goals is part of what I like about the character. She's an ambitious, smart, and independent person, pretending her and Thor were some star-crossed lovers, and that she would put her life on hold for 2 years because of him lessens this character for me. Also, Darcy interrupting her date was super obnoxious. In general, Kat Dennings is less well used in this movie. Pairing her off with this intern I couldn't care less about so she has someone to make snarky remarks to is their attempt to still give her character a place in this movie. But I find her character becomes much more grating when all she does is make snarky remarks. The focus of the first movie was primarily the relationships between fathers and sons, between brothers, or the whole family. Pretending the Jane and Thor romance was more than it was takes me out of this sequel. It's the same thing that worked against the Winter Soldier, banking on me buying into Steve and Bucky's friendship more than I ever really did. And I do think the problem is notably worse in the Dark World. Chris O'Dowd is a gem and deserves a shout out for generally being hilarious and likable. He probably deserved better than this role, but was still fun to watch. They probably should have had it that they had been dating for nearly 2 years and Jane had fully moved on. Then there's this awkward tension of Thor assuming she would wait for him, but she just went out and lived her life. Then they could play around with the angle of, I thought we were meant to be, with nobody but Thor really feeling that way, and this movie putting them in a circumstance where they really have to confront that and try to work through it. I don't know if that would have made it any better, but as it stands, it just doesn't play out well. There's no clearer way to exemplify how poorly this relationship is written than when Jane and Thor are reunited. They fight, he gets slapped, and the conversation breaks down into nonsense as they stare into each other's eyes and kiss. It's meant to be that they're too infatuated with each other to have a coherent conversation, but it plays out like they're experiencing simultaneous aneurysms. And it almost reinforces the idea that the only reason they're hooking up at all is that they're both hot, and both get blinded by that. You guys can barely speak to each other. Just admit that this is a spacefaring booty call. At least Darcy's exchange with Thor after this is worth a laugh.
How's space?
Space is fine.
Her character worked less well in this movie, but isn't irredeemable. Like with Thor 1, this movie suffers from being largely forgettable. It has fun moments and a lot of things to like, but no matter how big they make the conflict and stakes, none of it really seems to matter. The villain is potentially the biggest throwaway in the entirety of the MCU. Malekith has nothing going for him, and Eccleston is among the most wasted an actor has ever felt in a movie. Not just in an MCU movie, like in any movie. Very, very wasted. This is another hyper-linear movie without much else going for it in terms of B-plots, so I'll tackle my review mostly in order, breaking things down further after. The Asgardians and Dark Elves are established as an ancient conflict that is even older than the one with the Frost Giants, dating back to Odin's father, Bor, who has a super amazing helmet, by the way. Love all the crazy headgear these Asgardians wear. Having these movies open with a Odin-narrated fantasy epic is a trend I can get behind. We learn that the Dark Elves want to use the Aether to turn everything into primordial darkness, where the elves will rule. It's a standard universe domination motivation. Ho-hum, I don't care that much. We also see that the elves have these rage crystals, and once defeat was imminent, Malekith sacrifices many of his people in order to stop Asgard and make his getaway. The fact that he hates Asgard, wants the Aether, and is ruthless is all we ever really learn. He has now woken back up from that cryo-sleep with the beginning of the Convergence, a 1 in 5,000 year event where the 9 realms align and the Aether will be most effective. You know, for some reason. It's a contrived plot to explain why the contrived weapon is dangerous. I actually like that Thor considers the Dark Elves to be a scary bedtime story. It's funny to think of these intergalactic, godlike beings who live thousands of years having aspects of this universe they consider to be myth. After the big cool opening, Loki is being held as a prisoner, and his family seems to have largely given up on him.
It is my birthright.
Your birthright was today!
Goddamn, Odin. That's brutal. Maybe take it down a notch? There is fighting on Vanaheim while the realms are in disarray, with this interesting combination of swords, guns, and rockets. Thor shows up like his typical badass self, and I enjoy his first exchange.
I've got this completely under control.
Is that why everything's on fire?
Apparently these two armies just agree to stop fighting to watch Thor challenge this big Cronin warrior. I did not remember this species appearing before Ragnarok, so that's pretty cool to see. I hope Thor didn't just kill Korg's cousin or something. I had to laugh at Fandral being recast. I literally had to Google that character's name. That is by far the least significant recasting in the MCU. I bet Zachary Levi was stoked this nothing character gets killed in the next movie, so he could be freed up and go on to play Shazam. Asgard wouldn't feel very large if we didn't have Thor's friends. Without them, it'd seem like this entire realm is just one family and nobody else. So I get why these characters are stuck in these movies, but they also contribute nothing. We learn that the Bifrost was fixed, so that plot point from Thor 1 never really mattered, and it's annoying watching these back to back because it's nearly the very end and very start of the two movies, and so it matters less than you could possibly imagine. But the music as they soar back to Asgard is pretty great. Odin wants to steer Thor away from Jane, since her life will be a blip in his own. It's a pretty damn good reason, trying to matchmake Thor with Lady Sif instead. We see news reports of Erik Selvig running around naked, rambling at Stonehenge. It's meant to be played off as a funny joke, but I can't really laugh at what is clearly a man having a severe mental breakdown. They address it later.
Are you alright?
I've had a god in my brain. I don't recommend it.
But considering this movie's trying to be a little darker and more serious, I think it was a mistake to make this story some form of comedic relief. Jane and Darcy, with her intern who never matters at all, go to visit a site where some kids show them a floating truck. Not a van, I guess. I was wrong about that. And some strange portals. There is a bit of intrigue here, and some fine visual effects to help build that. Once Jane gets teleported to the hidden Aether, it attaches to her like a symbiote. Based on the context of this universe, it's very unclear why this stone is a goo sometimes, and why it doesn't kill a human instantly. I guess we can argue it transforms because it warps reality, and that it didn't want to kill its host. But if it can choose a host, why wouldn't it immediately leap to Thor or Odin or something the second it was in their vicinity? I assume they hadn't really nailed down the whole Infinity Stone arc yet, and that context for this MacGuffin was adopted later in development. I see no other way to explain how confusing the Reality Stone is and how much it doesn't do anything reality related. But I do kind of like how this is filmed. It's fairly stylized, with a splash of horror as it twists its way through her body. Later in the movie, Jane has an Aether-driven vision that is also pretty cool. I genuinely wish they leaned further into that cosmic, almost Lovecraftian horror visual language, and had more of these waking nightmares. That could have been such an amazing vibe for a movie titled The Dark World. And if Jane was continually getting visions of things that would help them fight against the Dark Elves, it would actually give her something to do in this movie. When Jane is teleported back to Earth, she's annoyed that the police are there, but learns she's been gone for 5 hours. Her worry is that this will bring the feds and S.H.I.E.L.D. to this site. Her becoming disillusioned with and resigning from S.H.I.E.L.D. happened during the Avengers, a movie she wasn't in. So the plot point tacked on to the end of Thor 1 is now already undone by the time this movie starts. Her joining S.H.I.E.L.D. was so absolutely useless. Ragnarok has gotten some criticism over the years for neglecting a lot of what happens in the first 2 movies. I'll have to see how true that is on a rewatch. But how can anyone really be all that upset when Thor 2 barely cares about what happened in Thor 1? This trilogy is so fragmented. There's this awesome visual surrounding Jane with this invisible bubble keeping the rain off of her that follows her around. I would have loved if every scene she was in warped reality in these small ways, seeing as it is the Reality Stone. And the stupidest thing is that all the reality warping we see through teleporting objects and floating vehicles seems to come from the convergence. So what exactly the Aether does in this movie is up for debate. The first act of Thor 2 is a decent mix of drama, action, and comedy. There are quite a few annoyances of plot details being totally abandoned, but it's a decent setup for this 5,000-year-old conflict with the Dark Elves, and the MacGuffin of the Aether is pretty standard fare. So far, the movie is fine. And the thing I most dislike is how they present Thor and Jane's relationship. Thor brings Jane to Asgard to extract the Aether from her. There are a few funny exchanges, like Jane knowing what the purpose of their mystical soul forge is.
That's a quantum field generator, isn't it?
It's a soul forge.
Does the soul forge transfer molecular energy from one place to another?
Yes.
Bringing back the idea from the first movie that magic and science are parallel. Odin swooshes in and compares her to a goat.
She does not belong here in Asgard any more than a goat belongs at a banquet table.
Did he just...
But what I most enjoy about this scene, in the larger context of this trilogy, is that Odin makes passing reference to war and bloodshed being the legacy of their people, with Bor all but destroying the Dark Elves. Apparently, their home world is as barren and awful as it is because Bor destroyed everything and poisoned the planet after. Holy crap, that insane genocidal detail never made it into the final movie. Loki draws attention to his own conquest of Earth being a continuation of that domination. I like the context this adds to the first Avengers movie, building on what was a pretty basic motive of ruling Earth. We kind of expect more from this trickster, so learning over time across several movies that it was a combination of wanting to impress Odin to take something from his brother to carve a path of his own, and acting as a pawn for Thanos, there is quite a bit baked into that invasion. I like when things are retroactively added to like this rather than hasty retcons. That family legacy of war is not directly important to this movie, but it's critically important to Ragnarok. It's cool that that's acknowledged at all prior to that third movie, even if Hela is never named explicitly. There is an insane chain of events here that's best not to think too hard on. The convergence has started, which randomly created a portal where Jane lives. Jane goes to investigate because she happens to study this sort of thing, and luckily her friend learned about it before any other authority figure. This anomaly just happens to teleport her to the hidden Aether. It attaches to her. Luckily, Jane happens to know the grandson of Malekith's nemesis, who takes her to Asgard. The arriving convergence wakes up Malekith. He's really good at sniffing the Aether out, so he instantly knows he needs to go to Asgard, which is the place he already has a rivalry with. That's two birds with one Infinity Stone. Don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Bohr knows this movie didn't spend a lot of time on any of it, and there are like 30 plot conveniences that need to take place for this to all occur. Movies always require a suspension of disbelief, especially anything remotely fantasy or sci-fi. These are space superheroes, for crying out loud. But that's maybe a few too many coincidences for me to stomach. We are now entering a portion of the movie that I kinda like. The Dark Elves allowed one of their own to be captured in disguise, and hides one of those rage crystals inside an open wound. That's disgusting and kind of awesome. The Rage Elf bashes his way out of captivity and starts letting prisoners out of their cells. Except Loki. I actually love the beat where it eyeballs Loki, and even this mutated hell monster knows not to mess around with him. With the jails now running rampant with freed prisoners, the Dark Elves storm the city with what remains of their fleet. The scene of Heimdall soloing one of these ships with a sword is hardcore, before a great reveal that it's a full-on invasion. I really dig the aerial dogfighting that occurs here. The Dark Elves have these cool, agile sword ships, while Asgard has this Viking-like fleet of winged ships that remind me both of their own winged helmets, as well as allowing us to infer that they were the inspiration for old Viking ships on Earth. The lore implied here and unique designs are great. It's like a fantasy version of Star Wars with TIE fighters versus X-Wings. I'm really into that. I have to laugh that when the shields are going up on the city, they just ram into the side of it. Go up and over next time, dummy. Asgard is apparently awful at defending itself. Like, there are somehow no defenses on the perimeter. It seems like these ships cross a lot of civilian territory and only get shot down once near the center of the city. They already made it a plot point that the rage dude in the prisons is able to lower their defenses. Why not have it so the defenses start farther out and also include, like, turrets and stuff? It just feels weirdly underdefended, especially for somewhere that has as many enemies as Asgard. And Heimdall, you're slipping up, my dude. That's two different people who were able to hide themselves from you in as many movies. Maybe that's why you should have some contingencies beyond one dude who stares off into the void all day while people constantly distract him with idle little chats. The way these elves rush in firing their laser guns feels even more Star Warsy, although their masks feel like they belong in a slasher horror movie. They're spooky and I really like the look of them. But by far the best thing they have is these black hole grenades. I love the effect of it, and they just cause so much devastation. Frigga had gone to check on Loki earlier. Between her teaching him her witching ways and being the only one to check on him, I wish we could have seen more of their relationship, especially in the first movie. It does a little bit to sell us on that bond, but it's left pretty half-baked. She sneaks a knife off of someone and uses illusions to protect Jane. Going toe-to-toe with Malekith, she actually kicks his ass. It's the big rage brute that instead stops her. I think it's fairly well handled and rather devastating when she is killed defending Jane. I love seeing Thor go beast mode here and actually wish they would have gone even further with that, because he chases the elves away fairly easily at this point. I wanted them to carry that fury and showcase like a 5-minute scene of him ripping apart these goons and their ships. It's maybe implied Malekith flees because he knows that's coming, but I feel pretty robbed in the moment. One of the best things in this movie was Thor jumping off of the balcony and sailing away with Mjolnir. Give me more of that awesome Thor action. The Dark Elves were 100% winning up to that point. The defenses are down, prisoners are running rampant everywhere, the Queen is dead, and they abandon the entire effort when Malekith's face gets a little cooked. Apparently, everyone was cool 5,000 years ago when Malekith sacrificed everyone for the good of their people. I feel like they could have done something interesting, like have a Dark Elf power struggle, where when Malekith tries to flee here, they're like, no, dude, again? Seriously? We're not gonna run just because you're hurt, we gotta see this through. I'm not sure you'll get another chance like this, dude. But because they just kind of slink away, they make it seem like all the elves are dead except for Malekith and like one other semi-important guy. Like, both sides kinda equally lost here. They hold a Viking funeral for Frigga, which is actually a beautiful scene. It's somber and gives everyone time to lament her loss and all those lost on Asgard. But it's still a fairly brief moment of reprieve and reflection, considering how devastating all this fighting just was. Both sides just get a chance to lick their wounds when really things had gone like 95% of the way through to a conclusion. And the movie now comes crashing down and starts feeling more aimless and poorly constructed. Up until this halfway point is actually pretty dang good. Honestly, better than the first Thor. I think the biggest mistake this movie makes is splitting the remainder of the movie in half to balance Earth and space. They brought Jane to Asgard, yet insist on still spending time back on Earth with Darcy and Eric, and it's just not needed. The Dark Elves invade Asgard, yet then they push them away as well. It brings everything together, pushes them all back apart, and needs to continually juggle all of them through that. On Earth, Eric is ranting and raving in an institute, and keeps saying realms instead of realms.
All 9 realms. All 9 realms are passing through each other.
Later, Darcy somehow claims him. I doubt it would be that easy. And they immediately see birds teleporting, which looks silly and is far too coincidental in terms of timing and proximity. The only way stumbling across that would make sense is if mini events like this were happening everywhere all day, and if that were the case, everyone would be running around losing their minds. Guess what saves you from explaining that little plot convenience? Ditching the Earthbound B-plot entirely. Why are we spending any time here? All of these movies are on Earth. I just don't need it or care about it at all. The Dark Elves sacked the hell out of Asgard, and they comment like 5 times on how Asgard is now defenseless. But don't worry, because the movie basically never comes back to that. Odin becomes vengeful and is prepared to go on the warpath for the first time in thousands of years. That is terrifying.
And how are you different from Malekith?
It shows Thor is growing and becoming a leader and mirrors Odin's lecture to Thor in the first movie.
That's pride and vanity talking, not leadership. You've forgotten everything I taught you.
But again, they don't do anything with that. It's a strong character moment for Thor, but we never really check back in with Odin after this. Thor wants to go to Malekith to remove the Aether from Jane so Thor can destroy Malekith and the Aether. But the Bifrost is now closed. Fixed, but closed. Honestly, how did these ships get onto Asgard earlier? They clearly weren't using the Bifrost, they just kind of sailed straight through the front entrance. So the idea of the Bifrost being the only way in and out doesn't matter, and as was shown in the first movie, Loki knows other ways in and out, so it doesn't matter. It's just dumb. They put so much importance on the Bifrost, and it just comes and goes, it opens and closes, people use it or they don't. It's just inconsistent. But I do like how lost Heimdall is, recognizing his failures on guard duty. Yet they still don't have him do much. He just kind of mopes about it. Jane is imprisoned and immediately gets set free. This is the aimlessness I'm talking about. People are being moved around left and right, but nothing that happens in the 5 to 10 minutes post-funeral matters at all. Thor is forced to go to Loki, bringing back the plot point that he knows secret forgotten ways on and off Asgard. There we go, at least we're making that old plot point matter.
Here?
I'm Loki, you may have heard.
Jane sure does love slapping gods in the face, eh? Pushing Thor and Loki back together will always be great. And this is where the movie mostly starts getting back on track. Their brotherly bickering and tenuous alliance is actually another great part of this movie. I've always enjoyed the reveal that Loki's cell is a miserable mess, and he chose to hide that fact from everyone around him. There's also a great scene earlier where Loki learns of his mother's death, plays it cool, and then has a blast of rage. He wouldn't even allow a random guard to see how much he cared and regretted not being there to help his mother. I'm kind of into the setup of this next sequence, having some Guy Ritchie-esque heist-like editing of the group planning how to get off Asgard, cut together with them executing that plan. For the second time in 2 movies, Heimdall breaks his oath to the king and immediately turns himself in. Everyone collectively understands Loki will try to betray them. I enjoy that they trick the trickster, with their overly conspicuous escape being a major part of the plan. I think Thor and Loki fighting about Frigga makes sense, but feels kind of forced in this scene.
What help were you in your cell?
Who put me there?
Who put me there? You know damn well. You know damn well who.
Quality dialogue is not a strong point of this movie, but it has its moments, like Loki's cheeky comment.
She wouldn't want us to fight.
Well, she wouldn't exactly be shocked.
His trustworthiness is continually in question, and they imply he's only on Thor's side now for their mother's sake.
Trust my rage.
While I would have rather seen more time spent between Loki and Frigga, they do their best to show how important that relationship was. It just could have been taken further. Scenes on the Dark World, like the Aether being drawn out of Jane, play out with some wicked Snyder vibes, but more like 300 rather than his actual superhero movies, which is kinda strange. I'm curious if that was the actual influence or not. And the Dark World itself is pretty disappointing. This is the titular setting, and it's just like a dark green desert? Maybe they should have kept in the plot point of Bor laying waste to this, as it would make the setting eerie and horrific rather than just kind of flat and disinteresting. I assume they didn't like the idea of turning this family into the villains, but it's so much more interesting to show that this family at large has gone from being these conquesting, dominating beings to sort of being these peacekeepers who are tenuously holding this power they seized, while the next generation in Thor tries to learn to become more peaceful, and Loki is out here just creating chaos. The more we peel back the layers about the family, the more it informs about these characters. I think people would see they're no longer the bad guys, and it just adds some interesting depth that is otherwise lacking. When these two work together, they're actually great. The moment when we think Loki cut off Thor's hand is awesome. I don't remember if I believed it on a first viewing, but it was a shocking visual nonetheless. The shadow beast elf thing recognizes Loki from the dungeons and vouches for his evilness. When they spring their trap, all I can think is, maybe Thor should have targeted Malekith first, not the Aether? This guy has a history of picking the wrong target during the big showdown. I say it as a joke, but only kind of. Maybe it's actually a consistent character flaw, that Thor wants vengeance and glory rather than the efficient kill and finale. When Loki saves Jane from the gravity well, I don't believe there's actually a ploy there. It could be said it was done to ingratiate himself to Thor before his final deception, but I think it's meant to be this singular, selfless act that shows he still is a good person on some level. Loki has no reason to care about Jane, and absolutely did that for Thor's sake. When the fighting kicks off properly, this shadow unit chucks a rock at Thor, and the physics of it look straight out of the 80s He-Man cartoon. It's not great, and it's damn comical when Thor is just getting fully pummeled into the dirt. Loki gets to show off some of his fighting style, which I wish we got to see more of. Loki sacrifices himself, but Malekith gets away with the Aether. I remember thinking back in the day how annoying it was that Loki was killed and revived twice, and now it's happened 3 times. I think that small heroic beat and redemption would have been a good send-off for the character, but I've come around to not caring so much about character deaths being undone on this wild franchise-long ride. These actors will eventually age out of the roles. Comic books insanely kill and revive people every other issue, so I don't really care here. Let's get the most out of these actors while we can, and if that means he dies 3 separate times, so be it. Just make sure that whatever final death or send-off you give him matters. And with how great Hiddleston is and has continued to be, it's a treat that they kept him around. Another thing Ragnarok gets a lot of flack for is undercutting serious moments. In this movie, like 2 seconds after Loki dies, we have the scene of Jane getting a phone call from wherever the hell they are, and it takes all the weight out of it. We're immediately distracted from it.
It's not me.
I honestly think Frigga's death deserved a slightly longer grieving period, but Loki definitely deserved more than 0 downtime, even if his death was a fake out. If anything, it makes his death far less believable because they don't spend time on it. And now we're down to Earth. The Dark Elves have what they want, they've seemingly won yet again, yet for whatever reason, they remove themselves from the plot again. The only good things to come from this Earth-centric stuff is Thor hanging Mjolnir on a coat rack, and Eric's reaction to Loki's death.
Loki is dead. Oh, thank God. I'm so sorry. Thank you.
There is a kind of cool idea with the monuments of Earth being hints as to where the convergence would localize, but that feels like an entirely different national treasure-like plot point. It's not given enough attention in this movie for me to care about. They cover that in a single piece of exposition rather than actually delving into the concept in any meaningful way, so just why bother? And how is anybody on Earth supposed to function when alien invasions are now occurring like once a year? I'd sure as hell quit my job and peace out, assuming the world would end any day. I'd go book myself a permanent vacation and ride out my days on some sunny beaches. Other than being on Earth, the final act of this movie is actually pretty great. Malekith touches down and his ship has this awesome spinal elevator that descends to the ground. But because we've now brought these characters back, why the hell did we leave the Dark World? Cut out that useless chunk in between there, have Thor going to Malekith with Jane being a kicking off point here, Malekith gets the upper hand, and now the climax is them fighting it out. There was no need to come back to, I can't say it enough times, this is stupid, I don't want to be on Earth in this movie, like ever. And it completely derails the movie to stop things so that everyone can be separated only to come back together again. Why do characters keep coming and going in this way? It's atrocious. Once this new fight starts, it's pretty lame when Malekith just shoots these Aether tendrils out at Thor. It's visually repetitive and lacks any threatening qualities. While we know this is a powerful thing, nothing is being done to really sell us on that danger. If they actually leaned into this being the Reality Stone, we could have some phenomenal things happening here. That could have taken a great finale up to a fantastic one. As is, it's pretty cool when they start fighting across the 9 realms of the convergence. There is this running gag of Thor teleporting and Mjolnir turns on a dime to redirect towards him. It's fun to drop back in on Jotunheim with another one of these giant icy dogs. All of this insanity is so damn fun and just conceptually excellent. While they're teleporting around, popping in and out of realms, they could have briefly visited Earth, but it doesn't need to be a central point that that they return to every second portal. It sure does take Thor long enough to realize he needs to attack Malekith, not the Aether, even though he should have directly learned that lesson with their previous conflict. Apparently, the original ending to this scene had Thor summoning lightning from all 9 realms to rain down on Malekith. That is so amazing, and they wouldn't have to worry about how that permanently scales up Thor's power or anything, because it's understood he would only be able to do that once every 5,000 years. They try to make the Earth portion of all of this matter. I do think they do a good job of showing the military as being futile, with jets getting sucked straight into a portal, and I guess it's a good callback to that earlier warehouse scene when the intern saves Darcy with a floating car. And I think it's kind of funny when Thor and Mjolnir are separated and he can't teleport and instead needs to take a train back to the fight. It disrupts the flow of the fight, but it's silly in a way that I can get behind. It's unintentionally hilarious that Eric has this techno stake that they can use to teleport around the bad guys, somehow out-MacGuffining the MacGuffin. And they even sort of won me over on that, purely with them teleporting Malekith in pieces. That's awesome. I think they should have done a bit of both, like Eric and Jane teleporting pieces of some bigger monster from another realm, or even using it on one of those Shadow Crystal Dark Elves. Then have Thor defeat Malekith with the 9 realm lightning, so you can have both of those cool finishing moves play out. This dude is wielding an Infinity Stone. Maybe it should take more than a stab from a homemade metal stake to take him out. But genuinely, the concept of fighting across portals was already brilliant. Throw in some Reality Stone weirdness and uber lightning, and this should have been the best third act of a Marvel movie yet. Instead, it's to good. We wrap the movie back up in Asgard. His heart-to-heart with Odin is pretty good. I have a love-hate thing here. I like that Thor now knows he's not ready to be king, but I hate that this touching moment for these two is undone by the Loki reveal. But I do love the idea that Thor's refusal of the throne is what allows Loki to take it for himself. But then, reaching even beyond this movie, this twist doesn't really matter. So yeah, love, hate. Jane is once again sad that Thor is gone, and since we never really buy their relationship, it just kind of feels lonely and pathetic. I really hope Love and Thunder doesn't try to rekindle this whimper of a romance, and they finally realize they probably shouldn't be together. Even if the events of that 4th movie make her able to live to 5,000 years old like Thor, I'd just rather not see them drag that back up all that time later and somehow try to make it matter. Just give Lady Sif some significant screen time for once and have her and Thor fall in love instead. Then Jane can go marry Beta Ray Bill or Frog Thor or something. The end credit painting animation is fine, it's a cool enough effect, but I'm not sure it really fits the movie thematically. It's just painting random scenes. Pretty to look at, but not that memorable, which I guess sums up a lot of this movie. The mid-credit scene is Volstagg and Sif bringing the Aether to the Collector. This is the most screen time these two have had all movie. I did not remember this scene at all. This must have been so confusing for the general audience. I know I would have rushed out to Google who the heck Benicio was playing. It is cool that they finally call the Aether and Tesseract Infinity Stones. Odin mentioned earlier that the Aether was older than the universe, but I think this is the first direct mention of them by name. As they're handing it over, the Collector is so obviously a bad dude. Come on. Not just the way he acts, but because his room is filled with people being held captive.
1 down. 5 to go.
That's so funny to me because he did nothing to collect this first one. Is he hoping all 6 of them are just going to be brought straight to him like this? And the end credit scene is Thor coming back to Earth to sneak a little slow-mo kiss. But even better than that, and something I actually care about, is the Jotunheim ice dog prancing around chasing some birds. Here's my list of odds and ends for Thor: The Dark World. We have another gratuitous shirtless scene with Thor, and Hemsworth is built like a damn triangle. He's just massive, which makes sense when playing a godlike being. I genuinely laughed at Volstagg doing another in the correct context with his beer after that opening battle. While I think generally the movie still looks good, it appears they took some of the shimmer out of it. I think a side-by-side of Heimdall shows this well. He's this luminescent gold in Thor 1 and is now more of a flashy bronze. It's not totally bland, so I think it was a choice that had more to do with reflecting this darker story rather than being washed out through sloppy color grading. Although the story also doesn't end up being all that dark. It's about a lot of literal physical dark things, but they still punch it up with so many jokes throughout that there's nothing all that dark about it thematically. You can tell they wanted it to be that, but absolutely pulled that punch. It's just a testament to how much they didn't know what they wanted to do with this character and series. How can I not shout out the scene of Loki shape-shifting while he and Thor walk together? It's already a great gag and cool scene, but then they drop the best cameo in the entire MCU.
Hey, want to have a rousing discussion about truth, honor, patriotism? God bless them.
As if that wasn't great enough, they layer in a musical sting for Captain America's theme, and Chris Evans is so clearly having so much fun playing Loki's imitation of Captain America. I love it. Finally, one of these movies addresses how stupid these onlookers are for watching these gods fight.
What are you all doing? You need to get out of here, now!
You're joking, right? That's Thor out there, he's waving his hammer around and everything.
I love seeing an actor I know now in an earlier bit part, like playing Student in Thor the Dark World. This dude is Istred in the Witcher series now. The worst parts of this movie are the forgettable villain, the Jane romance, and pretty well everything on Earth, which seems like a lot, but pretty much everything else is kind of great. This movie has high highs and low lows. The movie's momentum is completely killed by the Earth stuff pretty well every time there's an Earth scene. Forcing that in meant they had to sideline the Dark Elves for these long stretches. So within the movie, the elves come and go multiple times. They're in the intro, they return to sack Asgard, they show down with Thor on the Dark World, and come back once more for the finale. But it's all very disconnected throughout. The first part of this movie, up until the sacking, is kinda slow, but it mostly works. Then after the sacking, the pacing is all over the place. I genuinely find the plot more exciting than Thor 1, and there's way more action. Thor 1 does a better job of telling a complete story, but it's just kind of a simplistic story. It was hard to get wrong. And thank Odin, the Dutch angles are gone. And while I wish they'd played up the cosmic horror a little more, and I assume if they were able to go back and make the reality stone more reality warping, they would, but I think what we are presented largely looks pretty good. The best parts of this movie are any time Thor and Loki are together.
I think you missed a column.
Shut up!
The Star Wars-like attack on Asgard, and the finale being a portal-based battle, minus the Earth portion of it. And the soundtrack is leagues better than the first Thor, to me at least. This movie isn't really about anything. Frigga died, that sucked. We introduced a reality stone, but it didn't do a lot of reality stuff. Thor is still headstrong, but maybe less than the first movie, but a lot of it just isn't well executed and rarely leads to anything significant. Interesting plot points like Odin stirring up a new war are totally dropped, Heimdall committing treason again doesn't matter at all, Loki is killed off and revived within movie again, Malekith absolutely dominated Asgard, yet leaving them defenseless doesn't really matter, and while I guess that pushes Thor to go on the offense, that was probably what he was going to do anyway. Like I said early on, this is 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. The things that weigh this movie down weigh against it heavily. A weak villain and chemistry-deprived romance are huge issues. But a lot of the big battles and spacefaring interplanetary conflicts are really cool. There's some great concepts here in building mythology. And I think Loki is again really well handled and just made increasingly complex through this movie. It all averages out to a very mid-movie. But neither is it the abysmal train wreck people make it out to be. It improves on aspects of the first Thor and fumbles others. I was pretty entertained through most of it, especially things movies set on Asgard and other planets. In some ways, I think I like this movie better than the first Thor, with a stronger core identity. Because of that, I had originally given it a 6 out of 10 as well, and placed it just ahead of Thor 1. The Dark World is both better and worse than that first movie for totally different reasons. But I've found this opinion fluctuating more than any of my other ratings. And at the time of editing this, I find myself fixating on the negatives and considering most of them too difficult to overlook. So I will instead place this movie as a 5 out of 10 and lock it in as the most middle Marvel movie. It can become the fulcrum by which I judge other Marvel movies. Something that had equal amounts of things to like and dislike. Are these other movies better or worse than The Dark World? It sounds like this movie's production suffered the same fate as Iron Man 2, being overly meddled with. Early on in the MCU, it appears Marvel hired directors with their own vision, then cutting things up to fit more closely with a safer collective. I think they hired these directors wanting to allow them to do their own thing, but as their success grew, and they had to prove this franchise had some staying power past the first Avengers, I think that's when they started getting their hands deeper in these movies and cutting them up in ways that did them no favors. Directors like the Russos or Peyton Reed were more willing to deliver the intended Marvel product of these early 2010s. I want to say it was maybe around 2017 when Marvel gained the confidence that they couldn't really fail. This led to loosening the leashes on different directors, leading to more experimental and risk-taking movies, and it becoming less common for these movies to get butchered in the edit. Even today, Marvel is still within a safe zone, but it's been great to see boundaries once again getting pushed in this franchise after the Infinity Saga. But it's a shame movies like The Dark World clearly suffered from corporate heads trying to figure out what to do with this franchise that suddenly was the biggest thing on the planet. Luckily, more recently, they've started giving much more director freedom, sticking with individual creators across full trilogies, and allowing these individual series to find their own identities within the full franchise. We'll pick more at that thread in just a moment. For our next intermission, I want to look at Annihilation. This sci-fi psychological horror film stars Natalie Portman in the leading role. Tessa Thompson is also here, but she doesn't tie into the Thor series yet. This was written and directed by Alex Garland, based very loosely on a book by Jeff Vandermeer. Garland apparently read the book once, was inspired, and went about writing his own thing. He was never looking to make a straight adaptation, and I went and read the book just to see how much they differed, and oh man, do I ever think the movie is leagues better. The book is good in its own right, and still deserves a lot of credit for some great concepts that Garland adapted, but I felt the book got hung up on what I found to be some of the least interesting elements of this mysterious story, and is more about laying groundwork for the larger series than offering up any sort of satisfying conclusion. The story in the movie of Annihilation is simple. An anomalous shimmer appears in Florida. It has been growing for 3 years, and nobody has figured out what it means or does. Several military units have been sent in, never to return, now with the exception of Oscar Isaac's character. But even he's unable to explain what happened. This time, they are attempting a new approach, sending in scientists instead, led by his wife, played by Natalie Portman. It's then 2 hours of some of the most conceptually and visually creative sci-fi I've ever seen. It's set on Earth, so everything is familiar, but all refracted and twisted in unpredictable, alien, and often harrowing ways. The horror elements here are much more about being unsettled than straight up jump scaring you. I really enjoyed Garland's previous film, Ex Machina, so I threw Annihilation on one day off his name alone, and I could not get this movie out of my head after. In some ways, it's still living rent-free up there 5 years later. I immediately ran around consuming every theory and analysis I could find for this movie. I especially loved the podcast episode Small Beans did, highlighting all the incredibly layered storytelling and strong directorial choices that deftly reinforce the themes at hand. understand. It's just so well executed. I was so wrapped up in it that I watched the movie a second time just days later, and I've watched it multiple times since. The ending of the movie often splits people, but I think it's unique, engaging, beautiful, and memorable. I need more people to watch this movie because it's probably one of my favorites of the last decade. I left off after The Dark World talking about confused movie identities and directorial freedom, which is a great segue to talk about the third movie. Coming in 2017, Thor Ragnarok. And just kind of as an aside, god damn, I was such a sucker for the 80s style marketing surrounding this movie. Look at those splashy, colorful character posters, I think those are just great. It's no wonder this movie performed leaps and bounds better than the first two. Sure, Thor as a character was more well known, but I'm positive the marketing pulled in a much larger audience. It's never been signaled more clearly to comic book moviegoers that this is not going to match with what came before. And for this movie to succeed, the general audience kinda had to be shown that. Here now, on this rewatch, it's so strange to see the through lines of this series. There are elements that tie this trilogy together, but it is not solely Ragnarok that breaks the mold, because the series completely failed to ever set a real template. Thor 1 and 3 are primarily comedies, even though all of them can be comedic. Thor 1 and 2 spend extra time on Earth, but 2 and 3 also more heavily emphasize the spacefaring side of things. 2 and 3 tackle notably heavier topics, but go about it in completely different ways. 1 and 2 play up Asgard more, but the family drama elements are present in all the movies. They can each be considered the odd man out depending how you want to frame the argument. Thor 1 is the most Earth-focused, the Dark World doesn't match tonally, Ragnarok is more stylistically and comedically different, and I find that really interesting. Probably the thing that unifies these movies the most is Thor and Loki's relationship. That really seems to be the backbone, even though it's made use of in different ways, and occupies varying amounts of screen time. Pretty well every time these movies lean in on that are the most successful parts of each movie. However, Ragnarok does stand out the most, with the most obvious change in direction, fresh coat of brightly colored paint, and its distinct improvisational stylings. I won't pretend that isn't a dramatic change that stands out from the other two, but I think the constant flux of these movies and cherry-picking of what elements persisted left the door wide open for someone to do something different, and the choice was made to play up the comedy more than ever before. I've always disagreed with the sentiment that the humor undercuts the more serious moments of this movie, but broadly, not everyone reacts the same way to loss and tragedy. Just because Taika Waititi keeps it light and cracks jokes doesn't mean Thor isn't shattered inside. And before anyone tries to claim the Russos saved Thor after Ragnarok, Waititi, the Russos, and Feige were all collaborating to steer this story. This team made Ragnarok knowing the weight of it all would be addressed in Infinity War. The ramifications of this story wasn't scattered to the wind for someone else to salvage. This became the plan. I'm not speculating, that's factual. They've talked about it a lot. And I think that collaborative storytelling was a clever way to leave room for a lighter narrative and more colorful presentation in Thor 3 without ignoring the trauma the character experiences. It becomes this momentum of the story that he just doesn't have time to dwell or grieve. It doesn't excuse all the choices they make. There are moments that definitely could have played out more seriously within the moment, but it makes so much more sense of why this movie navigated the story the way it did. Luckily, I can look at this movie through the context of the full Infinity Saga, where Waititi worked with the Russos to complete Thor's arc and show in Infinity War how broken he actually is. Thor masks his pain in this comedic romp and immediately after bears the full weight of these events. Even within Infinity War, as he's detailing to Rocket the ways in which he's been affected and is horribly depressed. His solution is to try to smile and laugh his way through it. And they even pay that off further in Endgame, with him reaching a breaking point of no longer being able to put on a brave face through it all. It's incredibly realistic and interesting to me to show a character try to ignore their problems so heavily, push forward until they reach their own limit. I'm sure in 2017, seeing this movie on its own, I just enjoyed it thinking, that was fun. But it's kind of interesting across all these movies, there's a much more meaningful character arc playing out here. So much so to the point that he's somehow become one of the most well-used characters in the entire franchise. That context is so important. But before those movies came out, simply within Ragnarok, I have to admit it may have been an ill-managed choice to have a movie where Thor loses his hammer, father, and homeworld be entirely a comedy.
Sounds like you had a pretty special and intimate relationship with this hammer, and that losing it was almost comparable to losing a loved one.
It's a nice way of putting it.
And with the commitment to it being a comedy, whether or not it should have been this quirky improv style. If we take this complete arc into consideration and accept that it is okay for this movie to be an out-and-out comedy, then I personally am totally fine with the improv style. It might take some nuance out of the script at times. You're not going to land the most incredibly complex interwoven jokes when you're largely riffing in the moment, but it also gave me something I've never seen in a superhero movie before, and is something I don't think would have worked with another character or director. Can you imagine trying to sit through Kenneth Branagh's Captain America riffing with Bucky about being, patriotic or whatever? If they were ever going to try this, it almost needed to be with a campier and more cartoonish character. Leaning on a hero with actual superpowers who can travel between exciting new planets, interact with alien weirdos, someone who's really seen and done it all, then carried by Hemsworth's comedic chops? That's a huge win in my mind.
There was one time when we were children, he transformed himself into a snake, and he knows that I love snakes. So I went to pick up the snake to admire it, and he transformed back into himself, and he was like, "Yeah, it's me!" And he stabbed me.
Chris is so funny, and mostly what they had done with him up until this point is flashy shirtless scenes. I love him in the role, but he was underutilized before Ragnarok. I think the bigger issue may come about from a storytelling perspective. Showing Thor not reacting fully to these moments may imply to the audience that they were not that important, when really these are the things Thor cares about the most. So I get where people are coming from there. But I don't think it's as prevalent as people make it out to be. Major moments like Odin passing away and much of the third act on the bridge are played off more seriously and have plenty of room before the jokes come back in. The ones I find questionable are maybe Bruce slapping down on the bridge. It takes a little bit of the steam out of what should have been Banner's big moment, especially when they spent some time building up that if he becomes Hulk again, he may never come back. And actually having just rewatched The Incredible Hulk, I've now come fully around on this moment. I think it's hilarious because this is the second time Bruce has tried to do this exact big heroic moment, and it has failed both times. The pairing of those kind of makes both scenes funnier. So it's not the unexpected slapstick joke of him hitting the bridge that bothers me, it's the fact that they disregarded their own story thread in that moment. The one that really gets me is Korg making his joke as they fly away from an actively blowing up civilization.
The damage is not too bad. As long as the foundations are still strong, we can rebuild this place. It will become a haven for all peoples and aliens of the universe.
A perfectly Taika Waititi sort of joke, but we're right at the climax of the movie here, and the entirety of this, million-year-old Asgard is now just gone. It's probably not the right time to squeeze in a joke. But Odin and the hammer, those were played straight and quite seriously. I think the other one people might point to are the two separate times Thor and Loki have meaningful heart-to-hearts. One when Thor is taken captive, and Korg runs in with his
"Piss off, ghost!"
He's freaking gone.
And the second is when they're riding the elevator and they follow that up with Get Help. Neither of these bother me because I don't think these scenes really needed more room to breathe, and the nature of their relationship is so chaotic and up and down. An important part of this movie and the franchise at large is how much their relationship rubber bands all over the place. Serious, jokey, respectful, mocking, proud, ashamed, fearful, inspiring, it's all over the map. So going heart to heart, slapstick humor doesn't feel out of place. If people can point out other examples, I'd love to hear them, but I think it's kind of 50-50 in how well it handles those more dramatic moments. Rather than the more serious side of things, I think what I actually miss most about Thor as a character in Ragnarok were the glimpses of his age and intellect. He's 1,500 years old, has knowledge of every realm, knows alien species and languages, understands complex anomalies like the Convergence, yet he's a bit of a meathead in this movie. Even that's not a complete sticking point for me. In Thor 1, he tries to solve every problem by fighting. And in the Dark World, while being shown as growing and being more mature, Thor still assumes he can fly a spaceship, and his first approach to that is to start punching the controls. Maybe he showed a bit more wisdom the first two movies, but it's nothing new for him to be a bit of a goon. They played that up to great effect in the first movie, that he's the least regal and least formal of his family. They just didn't necessarily balance that out very well in Ragnarok. The comedy of this story can be a jarring presentation, but I think an important bit of context is that Hemsworth was basically done with the character. The hammed-up Shakespearean serious god character was boring to play again and again, and hadn't really grown or changed across most of his movie appearances. He supposedly became slightly more mature by the time the second movie rolled around, but it was a pretty minor shift. I would rather they completely start over and risk it all on something new than drag this character through some contractual obligation and force him to play a role he's no longer interested in. Sometimes I would think, okay man, you signed a contract, it's kinda your job to play this character, get over yourself, they're paying you millions. But he had already done 4 fairly repetitive movies. In this instance, I don't blame the guy for being totally sick of it. Look at examples like Jennifer Lawrence in the X-Men movies. The point in which she stopped caring is so readily apparent. Or Ben Affleck playing Batman. He seemed so excited to play the character, and then they totally did him dirty and he wanted out. Maybe there was a solution here that would have had this buddy road trip adventure as one movie, and the devastating destruction and loss be a separate movie. But the end result of that would have meant delaying the rest of the franchise to make room for a single character, and it would have just extended the viewer's whiplash across that now hypothetical 4-movie arc as they went from being comedic, dark. So they really had to pick a lane here, and their most recent case study showed that a more serious approach didn't go over very well. I try to understand the issues people take with Ragnarok and Waititi, and I think I mostly get it. But I would way rather have had this than some melancholy, depressed slog of a movie that no one enjoyed making. The failure of those first 2 movies to strike a balance justified this soft reboot. Maybe they could have attempted the serious tone once again and gotten it right the second time, but I doubt they could have convinced the general audience to turn up for that movie. The MCU already has a range of tones, and while I'd prefer maybe some tonal consistency within a character's individual series, when something's not working, a soft reboot is the right call. Without that, Hemsworth likely wouldn't have renewed his contract, and we would have lost pretty well the entire OG lineup all at once. While I'm talking about these movies at large anyways, it's not even unique to Thor. Suicide Squad was a hot, stinking pile of garbage, and The Suicide Squad was pretty great. Captain Marvel was super weak. There were parts of that movie that worked, but I was not all that interested to see a sequel with the same creative team. And while I haven't seen The Marvels yet, I think Nia DaCosta is a wonderful director, and I'm genuinely very excited to see what she did with the character. These movies need to challenge our expectations through storytelling, character growth, genre bending, visual shakeups, and so much more, usually through vastly different creative teams. It's already one of the biggest knocks against Marvel, one I disagree with, that these movies are all formulaic. If we suddenly insisted that they never try to innovate, we'd never get anything interesting in this franchise again. Sometimes these pivots and attempted tweaks are going to lead to dumpster fires, like Joss Whedon's Justice League. And sometimes they'll give us something I didn't even know I wanted, like Thor Ragnarok. I think the best argument I could make in favor of this is that while I'd potentially watch Thor 1 and 2 again someday, although I'm certainly not in any rush, I've been binging a lot of superhero movies, I would happily watch Ragnarok again like a month later, and still largely enjoy myself. I know this portion of the video has been more ramble than review so far. It feels like I'm going way out of my way to defend my position. I don't intend to convince anyone here. That's never really my aim with these videos. I'm really just trying to nail down my own preferences and open up some potentially interesting conversations with other fans. But considering there are people, even among Marvel fans, who outright hate this movie, maybe my explanation here can help them understand the perspective of someone who enjoys Ragnarok. I don't think it's hard to understand why someone would like a comedy, but the hurdle may instead be, why would you like a Thor comedy in a movie that's tackling such non-comedic topics? That's where that understanding on either side seems to break down. And I can acknowledge that a dark and serious Thor movie that killed off Odin, broke his hammer, and destroyed Asgard could have also been incredible, if not better, who's to say? Based on the original logo and the plot beats this movie needed to hit, it's obvious Marvel originally planned to play it off more seriously as well. But if watching 100 superhero movies has taught me anything, it's that any character and story can be successful if placed in the right hands and handled correctly. And in this particular instance, the right person for that darker story never emerged. And I'm instead happy that the end result for Ragnarok was something I could still enjoy on so many levels. I'll only lean on complaints and wish lists of what I wish a movie could or should have been when I dislike the movie, like Iron Man 2. That movie felt like such a mess that it left me fishing for a better movie within the wreckage. But when I still like and enjoy the version I've been given, I don't feel the need to dream up a different movie. Even when the more serious presentation of the events of Thor 3 can feel obvious at times. It never quite came together with Thor. Maybe as they get deeper into characters like Daredevil, Moon Knight, Blade, they'll find room to tackle darker stories in a separate corner of this universe that are given the space needed to be handled more seriously. I truly look forward to that, but I'm so glad they didn't force Thor to remain in that box. And now, after a long preamble for this movie, I think I'm ready to start digging into specifics. Right off the bat, the tongue-in-cheek,
I know what you're thinking. Oh no, Thor's in a cage, how did this happen?
Informs us of exactly the type of movie we're in for and the approach it's going to take. We're being dropped into unfamiliar territory, both the world it's set on and the emotions this movie's going to evoke, but we can immediately gauge the sillier tone, and now know this movie is going to seek out any avenue it can for a laugh. It's a bit odd to treat Thor as maybe going insane here. They never really address that again. I guess maybe he's just kind of bored waiting things out in that cage. But the hard cut to the skeleton still gets a chuckle, it's just unexpected.
Thor, son of Odin. Surtur, son of a bitch, you're still alive.
That line is perfect. And then the whole swinging chain gag is both great physical comedy and plays up how non-threatened Thor is. That's such a quick, successive delivery of varying jokes. And if at least one of those doesn't put a smile on your face, you're very likely in the category of hating this movie. Do I think all the jokes in Ragnarok are equally funny? Probably not. But you can feel how earnestly this movie wants you to enjoy yourself. And it works for me much more often than it doesn't. Some jokes are a bit more forced, but essentially none of them overstay their welcome. It's very rapid. Then, if you weren't already having a good time, things kick off with Immigrant Song to remind us that this movie isn't strictly about the jokes. The hammer tracking camera shots, Thor swinging together his hammer and lightning combos, fighting this insane dragon beast and then pinning its jaw with his hammer. It's so instantly the best fight in a Thor movie, filmed in such unique and exciting ways. Thor tries to get Heimdall's attention, and we're introduced to Karl Urban as Scourge, one of my favorite actors. Urban always goes 100% into every role, always flirting with a line of overacting, yet he somehow sells me on it every time. And he's so clearly having fun with this role. I think gags like the shake weight are a little too much for me. It's like plucking the meme of the week off Reddit's r/funny and plopping it in your movie. This one was never that funny and aged poorly like 2 weeks after this movie came out. There's just nothing clever about it. I won't dissect every joke, especially since humor can be so subjective. But my point is, the comedy in this movie isn't flawless, but even if something like this little topical shake weight gag doesn't land especially well, I'm okay with that joke falling flat when it's 2 seconds long and there are 7 surrounding jokes that did work. Maybe you aren't gonna laugh at dragon guts being splattered all over the wall. Again, slime humor isn't that highbrow. But keep in mind, these movies are also designed to entertain children. You might not laugh out loud over the dragon guts, but it's nothing to be upset about. Again, it's super quick. And I appreciate the effort this movie goes to jump between references, physical comedy, slapstick, wordplay, visual gags, and on and on. It switches it up so often, so you're unlikely to get sick of or bored with any particular type of joke. I'm not sure I'm a huge fan of Loki posing as Odin being unmasked so quickly. How Thor does that, summoning the hammer into Loki's face, is incredible. And it's not like this plot beat from the end of the second movie didn't have consequences for this universe and its characters, but undoing that in a way where we're deprived of seeing it play out directly feels like a mistake. Ragnarok obviously discarded a lot of what came before it, as it should have. I don't miss most of what was tossed aside, but this one maybe feels a little too rushed. However, this stupid little play is actually kind of brilliant. I love bringing in these actors to cameo as our main cast, and it's a smart move to make a joke out of what is essentially a previously on style dump of information for the audience. Those first 2 movies performed relatively poorly, and it had been a hot minute since they were released. So this was both the stupidest and best way to provide that exposition. I'll always enjoy seeing Hopkins play Loki playing Odin. It's the same reason I loved Chris Evans playing Loki playing Steve Rogers in the last movie. It's just an incredibly fun acting challenge. They do this Edgar Wright style quick cut to the teleporter down to Earth, on which we spend mercifully little time. And they make this short stint on Earth count. Doctor Strange starts whipping around, teleporting everyone and showing off. It's just great fun. I actually think I might enjoy him more in this movie than I did in his solo outing. Maybe he's just a more developed character at this point. And can we please bring back the yellow gloves? I feel like they add so much to the overall look. Even if they are bright and loud, I'll be bummed if they never bring those back. I have to laugh at the irony that Strange keeps a list of threats when he was so recently on Hydra's own list of threats. Captain America in the Dark World was my favorite cameo, but Strange in this movie is my favorite guest appearance. It's more substantial of a role, so I think it's fair to set them apart like that. And I think they do a great job of layering jokes into this scene while having a more stoic Doctor Strange not actually delivering them himself.
If you knew where he was, why didn't you call me?
You don't have a phone.
No, I don't have a phone, but you could have sent an electronic letter. It's called an email.
Yeah, do you have a computer?
No, what for?
I thought it was odd that Odin remained stuck on Earth for this duration, but they briefly explain that he was put in a trance of sorts, and we know Loki knows how to mask things from Heimdall. I think it's very interesting that Odin willingly stayed after breaking Loki's spell. They never explicitly state he was trying to teach his sons a lesson, but the way it all plays out, it does feel somewhat intentional on his part. It's not so much that he could have predicted exactly how this would play out, but his exile and the events that follow are the catalyst to finally bring them closer than they've been in a very long time. It's a great detail that he returns to Norway, where he would have fought the Frost Giants 1,000 years earlier and clearly has a personal attachment to. A lot of their history and culture was adapted from Asgard, and so it's really interesting that they would use that as a starting point to set up a new Asgardian colony. Odin took this time in solitude as an opportunity to reflect on the inevitability of Ragnarok and seeks out options for his people for after. How he leaves is a little abrupt, but I think he receives a strong, sentimental send-off, going out peacefully, working to save his people, and reuniting his sons. The music during this scene is excellent throughout and provides some nice closure while also leading into the unleashing of Hela. It seems like he also took advantage of this, knowing that when Hela emerged, he probably shouldn't be on Asgard. With this being the inciting incident, it all plays out very meaningfully, but there's still that wonder in the back of my mind of what more they could have done with Loki posing as Odin, even though they still pay that off through these scenes with Odin on Earth. Thor and Loki's simultaneous quick change is legitimately cooler than anything in the previous two Thor movies. This movie is very silly, but hot damn is it also good at being epic. Cate Blanchett maybe has the best voice of all time, and in general is simply phenomenal. As a total aside, I feel sorry for the new actress playing Galadriel.
3 were given to the elves, immortal, wisest and fairest of all beings. 7 to the dwarf lords, great miners and craftsmen of the mountain halls. And 9 rings were gifted to the race of men, who above all else desire power.
3 rings for the elven kings under the sky. 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone. 9 for mortal men doomed to die.
How can anyone stack up to that? Taking things back to Ragnarok. I'm obsessed with the way she hisses out her lines, reveling in playing a villain. Her boss bitch goth rock star vibe is to die for. And again, we have yet another actor clearly having the time of their life playing this character, chewing the scenery. It'll be a recurring theme in this review how obviously committed to this movie everyone is. How can you not love a movie where everyone involved was clearly enjoying the process this much? You can feel it in every single scene. Like 15 minutes earlier at the top of this movie, it reminded us how unstoppable Thor is with his hammer. Now, stripping him of that while establishing Hela as a threat is an excellent turn to take. I see she also follows the family tradition of wearing insane headgear. I love it. I'm here for it. She strokes that thing into existence like 5 times, and I enjoy it each and every time, no matter how impractical. It's such a damn shame that no matter how cool the character is and how excellent the casting of Blanchett was, it doesn't save Hela from being a mid-tier villain. Her performance is captivating, but her motivation is kill everyone. That's it. There's zero depth to that. It's disappointing, as that feels like one of the most heavily lacking parts of this movie. I enjoy the heck out of watching her spin around, flinging her big spear swords, or slipping down into that crypt with a smooth, graceful drop. And of course, there's the Valkyrie sequence. A lot of the coolest looking stuff in this movie surrounds Hela, with that flashback being one of the most gorgeous things in the entire MCU. But it doesn't save her from being a bland-ass villain. It's unclear why Volstagg is running the Bifrost, not Scourge, but whatever. He and Zachary Levi both get killed. I don't even care to look up Zachary's character's name again. That's how unimportant he was to these movies. I agree, the Warriors 3 were killed unceremoniously, and I don't think they even address where Lady Sif is, but these movies never cared about any of them, so why pretend to care now? And why place the burden on Taika to fix that? It would have been impressive if he made use of these nothing characters in a meaningful way, but I can't blame him for knocking over that stack of blocks and building something of his own. And again, having Hela stomp all these supposedly powerful characters into the dirt while she effortlessly flies around stabbing people is great fun to watch. And it kinda sets the precedent that fighting her directly maybe isn't going to be an option. That level of death is horrifying, and it's very fitting of her title. As Thor goes spinning off towards Sakaar, this is where Taika really starts to go buck wild. He's been doing his own thing this whole movie, but from the second act onwards is where we get to see a director finally shower their influence over one of these movies in full force. There were glimmers of that before. James Gunn walked with Guardians of the Galaxy so Taika could run with Ragnarok. Even the original Guardians, things got pushed more towards that washed out color palette, and the alien worlds maybe weren't as wild and over the top as they could have been, but the very same year as Ragnarok in 2017, Gunn put out Guardians 2, which really showed what he could do visually when he wasn't limited by the Marvel mold. That was a very pivotal year, and while many other Marvel movies were already in their various levels of production, meaning they didn't quite all escape those more bland visual through lines, I think these movies, especially Guardians 2, deserve so much credit for bringing color back into Marvel movies. As Act 2 kicks off, we have this awesome 80s sci-fi synth that starts to frequent the entire soundtrack. There's the Jack Kirby-inspired structures and visuals, many weirdo alien characters. It all comes together into something wild, unexpected, and super special. Even just that shot of Thor plummeting down to the junkyard. That's so great, and I'm immediately sold on this colorful new direction. And rather than mentioning it a dozen times, I'll say now, the soundtrack in this movie rules. I love the direction it takes from this point in the movie onwards, but even in that earlier part of the movie, it stood out among the rest and is easily the best Thor soundtrack. It adds such a fun layer to this intergalactic buddy team-up, rainbow-colored space fantasy adventure. I'm hopeful in the next movie they play around with some new visual themes and stylings, just to switch it up and really push those limits, but I really want them to maintain the energy of this soundtrack. I wanted to look something up quickly about this soundtrack, and I learned that the composer has credited the Every Frame a Painting YouTube video that criticizes the MCU for having no memorable soundtracks, then making it his specific mission to make a memorable soundtrack, and I would say, mission accomplished. That is so incredible how far-reaching that channel was. Truly one of the all-time bests. Tessa Thompson is wonderful in everything I've ever seen her in. Have I said enough times how much I enjoy this cast and how much they clearly enjoyed it? This movie is packed with great additions to the MCU. She has more swagger than possibly every other character in this universe. Sure, someone like Tony Stark is very confident, but no one else quite has this same cool, I don't give a damn energy. From her drunk stumbling to palling around with Hulk, to her little shimmy when she's using the cannon in the climax, or strutting up the bridge with a bunch of fireworks in the background, you cannot look away from Tessa. I imagine Loki won't be in Love and Thunder, so I'm excited to hopefully see her upgraded to an even bigger co-leading role. I'll admit it's pretty obvious how often everyone is standing in front of a green screen. Look at that shot of her testing the gloves that operate her ship's weapon. It's hard to miss. But it's not enough to take me out of this movie. I was insisting that these movies spend more time in space, and in order to do that without it costing twice as much, since there's no real ability to do location shooting, they relied heavily on CG. We're on an alien planet filled with strange creatures, tech, and everything else. When none of it is rooted in reality, and would largely be impractical to attempt to literally build, it makes sense to use a green screen. It just happens to be extra apparent in a few of these scenes. I prefer when things are set on Earth that you build and film an actual set. It's pretty well always going to look better. But I'm not sure that was an option with this being set where it was, especially with the tight turnaround times of Marvel putting out like 4 of these a year. These are the compromises they have to start making, and if I want a movie set entirely in space, I have to accept that. Instead, what I most dislike about this scene is the God of Thunder repeatedly being done in by what seems like electricity. They shock him with this net, then like 16 more times with this little neck thing. I had to go looking this up. Apparently it's a neurotoxin and it's attacking his nerves and you can see little blue veins. That's fine. I don't care. Sure, I'm totally okay with that. But then why did you give it a little bzzzt sound effect and have him shake around on the ground like he's being shocked? He's the God of Thunder, and you're visually and audibly communicating to me that he's being electrocuted. It was a funny, ironic little twist in the first movie and made sense because he was stripped of his powers. Here, he's still friggin' Thor, the God of Thunder. It's just such an easy thing to fix, and I don't know how anyone managed to overlook that. Make it look different, sound different, include a line of dialogue, anything. I had a whole rant in the script here that was undone by Googling what the device actually was, and I think it's just kind of a sloppy oversight. It's nitpicky, but I'm standing by that one. I'm a fan of the way this movie expands the entire universe even beyond its own scope, indicating that the 9 realms are instead simply the number Odin had conquered and oversees. Not the be-all, end-all encapsulating everything like I thought it was. That always seemed rather limiting, and that's immediately exciting as it leaves room for infinite weirdness in future movies. Like, the Grand Master hasn't even heard of Asgard.
We're not friends and I don't give a shit about your games. I'm going back to Asgard.
Asgard?
That's such a simple and effective way to open up our comprehension of how large this universe actually is. Overall, the way they built us through city, Earth, galaxy, 9 realms, universe, and multiverse was incredibly well handled, slowly building all that up. And now, rather than setting things on a frozen wasteland or a dark wasteland, we actually get to go somewhere colorful, weird, and fun. I desperately need to find new adjectives. Thor moves through this odd sci-fi Willy Wonka reference of an amusement park ride ending on this horror beat. Good luck fitting something as absurd as that into the Dark World script. Casting Jeff Goldblum to play Jeff Goldblum is always a correct choice.
You're officially pardoned from life.
Oh my God!
I'm stepping in it. Look. Wow.
Look at that little smile as Thompson touches his cheek and tell me you don't love this man. You can't. And if you do, then I know you're lying. And then he just starts DJing a space rave. I have no idea what is going on here, and that's what I love about it. They did the whole intergalactic political posturing for 2 movies, and it never led to anything interesting. Now just drop me on this chaotic dumpster fire planet with rando aliens, and let's enjoy ourselves.
Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Korg. I'm kind of like the leader in here. I'm made of rocks, as you can see, but don't let that intimidate you. You don't need to be afraid unless you're made of scissors.
I don't know if everyone has seen What We Do in the Shadows, Hunt for the Wilder People, or Jojo Rabbit. Those movies are all phenomenal. I also grew up with Flight of the Conchords, which is one of the earliest things Waititi was involved in. So it's such a delight to see him and his New Zealander humor and sensibilities literally physically in this movie, as well as driving the entire thing. I'm not certain if people who dislike Korg dislike everything Taika has done, or maybe they just feel this oddball doesn't fit in this movie or universe. Maybe it would help to be exposed to that wonderfully dry sense of humor in a more grounded setting first, like Hunt for the Wilder People. There's jokes like printing pamphlets, Freaky Circle, or Piss Off Ghost that I could imagine might irritate people who don't have that frame of reference. The jokes that come from Korg are the most Taika Waititi jokes in the movie, obviously. So I imagine the people who dislike the character just find that jarring. But having been a fan of Taika and his offbeat comedy for well over a decade, it's a breath of fresh air in a franchise that relies heavily on quips and topical references for its humor. I'm so happy to learn on this rewatch that these early movies often had more character-driven humor than I remembered, but this is still an appreciated change-up. Some of the totally immature jokes maybe got a chuckle from me the first time.
We're going through the big one.
The devil's anus.
Anus? Wait. Who's anus?
Smushing dirty words together maybe gets a loud nostril exhale once, but never really holds up for me. On the other hand...
You rode a hammer.
No, I didn't ride the hammer.
The hammer rode you on your back.
No. I used to spin it really fast, and it would pull me off the...
Oh my God, the hammer pulled you off.
The ground. It would pull me off the ground up into the air, and I would fly.
That's the sort of immature wordplay I can get behind. Fill me up with more hot loads of that comedy goodness, please. Really, even the juvenile devil's anus naming is still made funny by the follow-up delivery of...
For the record, I didn't know it was called that when I picked it.
This movie knows not to overstay its welcome on any single joke, has a few running gags that get funnier as the movie goes, and even in the few instances a joke doesn't totally work for me, there's usually a 1-2 delivery that makes the initial joke funnier. Have I said this movie is funny yet? I don't know if I've really driven that home very well. I worried I'd be sick of it this time around, but the jokes are so often character and context based that they still haven't aged poorly, and most of them never will. A plot point that was referenced in The Dark World, but I like seeing play out here, was Hela revealing the hidden mural on the roof.
Odin. Proud to have it. Shamed of how he got it.
Odd that they built around that rather than painting over it. You're losing like a few inches of roof there. It's gonna make the room feel awfully crowded. It's also strange that when people in this society live to be 5,000 years old, somehow nobody remembers any of this. Did Odin squash that out? Was he secretly a media-controlling tyrant? Yikes. Tessa Thompson was clearly around for that. How old is she supposed to be? Jeez. It's wild that it shows Hela used to wield Mjolnir. It adds this crazy bit of history to that weapon, that maybe it wasn't always a matter of being worthy and wielding the power of Thor, as there was no Thor at the time. As she moves through the treasure room, acknowledging but pushing away the previous Infinity Gauntlet Easter egg is such a hilarious retcon. She completely dismisses the Frost casket, but actually does admire the Infinity Stone for a second. Maybe it would have been a cool what-if episode if she took that opportunity to start collecting the stones. And the Eternal Flame is actually so cool. It's a lot easier to get behind a MacGuffin in the plot when what it does is clear, the consequences are laid out, and everything surrounding it just looks rad. I think this movie draws a really effective parallel between Thor and Loki, that they've now both been lied to all their lives. It's one of a few times we've seen where they are able to properly relate to one another. Of course, Loki is trying to position himself to take over, but genuinely offers Thor the opportunity to rule together. They both seem fully aware they are polar opposites, but are constantly looking for ways to repair that relationship. I love the through line in this movie, that Thor is the one who feels they are now too far gone, and it's instead Loki who tries more actively to patch things up. Although he of course does try to betray Thor as much as ever. We're taking baby steps here. And since I paired these scenes together before, we also have them working through some family issues.
Loki, I thought the world of you. I thought we were gonna fight side by side forever, but at the end of the day, you're you and I'm me. And I don't know, maybe there's still good in you, but let's be honest, our paths diverged a long time ago.
That's so damn touching. It's one of my favorite interactions between them. But this is a comedy with a capital C. For me, Get Help is just stupid enough and clearly humiliating for Loki, a grown-ass god, that I can't help but laugh at it. It's apparent that at some point a strapping young Thor crafted this plan, and even cunning Loki somehow never thought of anything better. Then, like 2 seconds later, they're carrying carrying these massive laser chain guns around, just being dope as hell. Thor predicts the betrayal that follows, showing his own little growth, while calling out Loki for never changing.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that you'll always be the god of mischief, but you could be more.
People will often insist that we should turn our brains off for certain blockbusters and just have fun. Like, sure, the Fast and Furious movies are dumb, but just turn your brain off and have fun. We hear it every time a big budget movie is critically panned. And while it fits for some movies, that shouldn't be our standard for every big action movie. And I want to put it forward that Ragnarok is bright, loud, silly, zany, and yes, fun, without sacrificing a quality story and some great character work. And the fact that they still find room for more meaningful, reflective scenes like Thor and Loki digging into their damaged relationship is fantastic. And with this movie being a mix of all those elements, we've arrived at a great example of a scene that is fun above all else. I love how often comic book movies find excuses for these heroes to go toe-to-toe, and I think this is one of the best examples of that. They're not pulling their punches in quite the same way because they know they can barely hurt one another, and it's playing out against their will. Maybe more against Thor's will than Hulk's. And it's made even more fun by it being a rematch from the first Avengers. Having this gladiator planet that forces this scenario is simple but so clever. The tease of incredible is such a perfect way to nod to the comics and the first Hulk movie. They know that's an effective enough nod that they don't even let the full sentence play out. This fight is just great to watch as they mangle each other, but I also love the jokes throughout.
Yes!
I have to get off this planet.
Hey! We know each other! He's a friend from work! Oh, Banner, I never thought I would say this, but I'm happy to see you.
There is so much great character humor, context-based jokes, self-references, and so much else going on here. While I dislike the odd joke in this movie, the vast majority of the jokes in Ragnarok manage to be funnier than the majority of jokes in every other MCU movie. Even Thor trying to pull the whole
The sun's getting real low. That's it. Sun's going down. I won't hurt you anymore. No one will.
Is an effective fake out, and his goofy ear-to-ear smile right before he gets punched is funny all on its own. That single image of Chris Hemsworth is evidence enough that he was wasted in the first two Thor movies. I've generally praised a lot of the humor in the 8 previous movies I've reviewed. It pleases me to be reminded that the only one of these movies that tried to be a straight comedy managed to also be the funniest. It would have been a big miss for this franchise, and this movie wouldn't have worked at all if it didn't actually make me laugh. And if you're somehow unable to laugh at any of this, then yeah, you're gonna hate this movie. No other director was brave enough to give us Naked Hulk. I guess you can't do a gratuitous shirtless scene with a character that's always shirtless. Might as well show us some big steamy green buns instead.
That's in my brain now.
You can tell Ruffalo had a lot of fun fully embodying the character using mocap as well as his own voice.
Yeah, same. Hulk like fire, Thor like water.
Well, kind of both like fire.
But Hulk like real fire.
Hemsworth clearly cracks at that one, and it still made it into the final cut. There's just something special about a genuine moment like that, making it into this mega blockbuster of a franchise that's famously planned so far ahead. It's at odds with that structured presentation in the best possible way. I love the concept that when Hulk has an outlet with this arena, it curbs his natural raging, yet Hulk still throws a little tantrum because he sees Thor is pissed off. He's able to mostly hold it together and lashes out in this childlike monkey see, monkey do sort of way. This movie actually endears us to this monstrous rage machine. Having Hulk talk and interact, adding depth and showing ways in which he's separate and distinct from Banner, is something I'm really grateful for in this movie. Although it's a good representation of something this franchise does incredibly poorly. All of Hulk's major changes and developments happen off-screen. Banner masters changing into the Hulk without us ever seeing it. Hulk becomes more of a distinct personality during a 2-year gap. And worst of all, Banner fuses with Hulk to make Professor Hulk completely and totally off screen. I can save some of that for the later reviews, but that's the price they pay for relegating this character to the background and not risking it on any further solo movies. So that is quite bothersome. Thor bouncing the ball into his own head borders on a little too slapstick. I'm certain I laughed at it the first time around, it's quite shocking, but again, it's the way Chris jumps back up and tries to play it off cool that still carries the gag for me. And they immediately follow that up with this awesome music and action as he leaps down into Sakaar. Potentially my favorite gag in this entire movie is Thor trying to access the Quinjet computer with phrases like God of Thunder and Strongest Avenger, only to realize Stark programmed this ship.
Damn you, Stark. Point Break.
Welcome, Point Break.
I appreciate that as a callback, and that they would put the effort into crafting a joke that's specifically targeted at the superfans who have watched every single one of these movies. After 2 years of Hulk and rage, a recording of Natasha being the one to calm Banner down shows the sun's getting low thing has so much more to do with her than the actual phrase. It's such a great payoff, and it's actually quite tragic that these characters never had the opportunity for their romance to properly play out. I feel like they both deserved that. The visual effects of Hulk and Banner fighting for control are the best we've ever seen with this character. He seems genuinely tormented. It's moments like that that make me truly wish we had at least one solo Hulk movie with Ruffalo. I've seen people over the years declare it's unfunny that Thor then repeats the sun's getting low line like 12 times as they're running around the streets of Sakaar, but I still enjoy that as well. Thor is nervous as hell, knowing if Hulk comes back, they'll get caught, and he'll likely get beat up again. Thor is haphazardly trying to use this trick that we've already seen he can't pull off. The panic and desperation from Thor and clear annoyance from Bruce are what still make that work for me. We have Thor's mirrored conversation with Hulk and Banner shit-talking the other, and it's just a great repeated bit. These two are an amazing odd couple pairing, and I would happily watch a trilogy of them going on adventures together.
Quite a lot's happened. You and I had a fight recently.
Did I win?
No, I won, easily.
Doesn't sound right.
Well, it's true.
I have to quickly admire what insanely clever pre-planning and character placement it was to ensure the two unkillable gods weren't present for Civil War. Marvel is just so smart with how they set those things up. Loki and Valkyrie's fight is pretty cool. I want to see more of knife fighting Loki, but also him grabbing at her mind is a cool trick, let alone the way it leads to this stunning sequence. We've now got the Revengers formed up. The running bit of Bruce and Valkyrie feeling like they know each other is great. And after having tested Loki's illusions a few times, Thor's instinct to throw a can at his head is logical and fairly funny. I love the idea that even though he's basically a god, having a little tin can thrown at your head is always going to be unpleasant and annoying. I do wish this movie found a bit more time to build Thor and Valkyrie's relationship so that it'd make more sense for her to join their mission. Otherwise, it feels like a pretty impulsive thing after just one pep talk. I guess it's due to her vendetta against Hela, I could buy that, and surely they'll build up their relationship more in the next movie. They debate whether they can trust Loki, and I do find that during these multi-character improv sessions, you can tell Hemsworth loses the more regal side of Thor, while Ruffalo veers closer to just being himself rather than Bruce Banner. It's gotta be tough to improv in character, and they mostly achieve that, but it does waver a bit in scenes like this. We're flirting with losing that suspension of disbelief there. Heimdall has been leading a resistance on Asgard, stealing the key to the Bifrost and slaying zombie warriors with it. Idris Elba also was happy to be here after simply collecting a paycheck for 2 movies. They don't even do that much with him in Ragnarok, but he has more to do than hang out on a bridge, and the energy on set was so positive that it was the only time that he enjoyed playing the role. I love that for him. The moment when Thor gets in touch and temporarily has Heimdall's eyes is so damn cool. Every scene with Heimdall makes me wish they found a way to make Idris a bigger part of these movies. It does feel a little odd that Hela is having trouble finding the Resistance, yet Valkyrie finds them in like 2 seconds with the random ship they took, and Heimdall somehow doesn't see the trap being laid for them on the bridge. I don't entirely know how his sight powers work, but he's been outsmarted at least once per movie? What can you see, my guy? You better book an optometry appointment sometime soon here. Speaking of eyeballs, I really dig the fight between Hela and Thor, but the part I like the least is how little sense him losing the eye makes. The effect just sort of looks crappy and obviously added in post. Thor then fully missing an eye with a big black hole in his head doesn't match up with Hela's slicing action. Maybe that's the best they could do with a PG-13 rating. I'm also clearly nitpicking, but it looks lame. Across this fight, Thor gets messed up and stabbed just so many times. He really shrugs that shit off. There is this massive, horrific war happening. People are dying left and right. Hela is clearly winning, and everything seems bleak. They take this more intense section and dial it up to 11 with one of the all-time best needle drops. I could genuinely watch Thor slow-mo soaring through the air as that music kicks in 30 times in a row. I'm pretty sure I left my jaw on the floor of the theater 5 years ago. It's quite possibly my favorite moment in the entire MCU. It's certainly among the biggest power-ups a character ever received. I even love Loki's little smirk as he knows what's coming. And looking at Thor's scene with Odin leading into that, I've seen people say they dislike the God of Hammers line, but I don't think it was meant to imply that Mjolnir wasn't important. The movie repeatedly addresses that it was, but Odin recognizes that it's gone and not coming back. There's no time to be sentimental, so he's snapping Thor awake to remind him that he is still the goddamn God of Thunder. I know the hammer is synonymous with the character, but after 4 movies of him barely using any thunder powers, this was the exact power-up I was hoping for. He's not going to play this character forever, why not make some dramatic changes along the way? In our finales of each trilogy, we had Tony destroy his suits, Cap give up his shield, and Thor lose his hammer. It was instrumental to the larger story for each character to suffer a defining loss ahead of Thanos' arrival. So I strongly disagree with anyone who dislikes destroying the hammer. That moment served numerous significant purposes in this movie and across the franchise, and Odin serving up his cheeky reminder of how powerful his son is all on his own builds on the encouragement he gave earlier in the film. It feels so significant that Odin would be there to support his son one last time before parting ways for good. The movie now just goes balls to the wall for the remainder of the runtime. We have other amazing bits of imagery like Valkyrie strutting in front of the fireworks, Hulk squaring off against a giant zombie wolf, Loki using his helmet as a weapon, Heimdall's out there just wrecking things, and we complete the background story arc of Scourge finding his redemption.
For Asgard.
How great is that? Forget Chekhov's gun, this is Waititi's guns. This is without a doubt the best third act fight in any of these movies so far. It's not even close. There is spectacle, fanfare, and comic booky splash page visuals that I want in these movies. The solution to this climax being to intentionally cause Ragnarok is phenomenal. That's so much more interesting than punching each other until someone gives up. It pays off Surtur, the Eternal Flame, the Prophecy, Hela being powered by Asgard, Thor growing into the role of a ruler, Loki being capable of being a team player, even though he does still nick the Tesseract, which is another great little character moment and setup, Asgard being a people, not a place, all ending off with Hela and Surtur battling it out for domination of Asgard. It feels like the only way it really could have ended. It's just satisfying on so many levels, and throwing in Hulk trying to fight Surtur still cracks me up.
Just for once in your life, don't smash!
Big monster!
Aw, he just wants to help. As forced and not needed as Korg's line is at the end, the movie wraps up in such a great place. Thor looks fantastic with an eye patch, while also physically connecting him more closely to Odin. Thor and Loki feel like they've finally figured some things out. Asgard and its people have weathered Ragnarok and Hela, while also knowing where they ought to head next. Thor rejected the throne before, but through this movie proves to himself and to others he's finally ready to lead. So much of this movie works so well. I'm so happy that this franchise is starting to more commonly have these mini team-ups. I still want room for solo movies, but there is so much more potential to be realized by pushing characters together into these 2 or 3 person co-led movies. The colorful end credit sequence is fine, I guess. It's better than some of the others that have come before, but the music is excellent. I'll probably do my little internal ranking of these end credit sequences as part of my Avengers review, undecided where exactly that should go. Our mid-credit scene is Thanos' ship leading us straight into Infinity War, which, if you were to watch that movie immediately after, would be such an aggressive tonal gear shift, and I kinda love that. It's like when the tempo changes in a song halfway through, right when you're getting into the groove, and a very specific part of your brain lights up. Ragnarok has you laughing and clapping for 2 hours just to slap you in the face as soon as Infinity War starts. At least that saved them from taking Loki to Earth? I don't think that would have gone over very well. And there's one last scene of the Grandmaster, which is funny, but if he's a Celestial, what's his deal? Is he actually defenseless? That seems odd to me. My extra notes that I made to reserve for the end here. First, I'm glad they cut Jane out of this movie. There was obviously no room for her or any other of the Earth characters. That being said, Thor 4 seems to be coming at a point in this franchise where larger setups aren't as necessary, so I imagine Taika Waititi had a lot of freedom this time to tackle whatever story he wanted, and is only choosing to incorporate Jane because he saw an effective way to do so. And knowing that his pitch is the only reason Natalie Portman agreed to come back to this franchise makes me so excited to see what this guy has planned for Jane and Thor in a movie he was involved with from square one. It's going to be really interesting to stack that movie up against Ragnarok and see maybe how his approach differs with that in mind. This might be among my favorite of the Stan Lee cameos. His cackle is great, and I love Thor using the phrase "by Odin's beard." Plus he just starts blubbering about getting his hair cut, and the new look suits him.
What happened to your hair?
Oh, some creepy old man cut it off.
It looks good.
Oh, thanks.
Where are we?
Once he has the revised wing helm, red face paint, blue pauldron, and half cape, this is probably my favorite Thor look yet. The small visual gag of dressing Banner in Stark's clothes is a funny nod to the larger franchise. It's not very often these movies include wardrobe gags, so that's appreciated here. And I just want to shout out Karl Urban once more. They gave him so few lines, but the camera can't help but focus on this guy. He does such a top-tier job communicating with his eyes and face even when he's not the focus of a scene. I would have happily seen more of this character thanks to Urban's performance. I rewrote this review a few times, trying to decide if I should review the movie linearly, focusing on characters or the humor in isolation. It took a lot of revisions, but I chose to follow the linear review view structure used for the first 2 Thor movies to keep that approach feeling more consistent within this video. I hope people don't mind the small ways in which I kind of break that. I don't really have much of a template here. It's more about just trying to share everything I have to say about these movies, and allowing the points I'm trying to make to dictate the structure of these scripts. I hope it came together because it required a lot of jumping around. I don't think I can say this movie is fun and funny in any new ways I haven't already covered. I've hammered on about that enough. Pun intended. The music, production design, sets, costumes, effects, presentation all sell the movie incredibly well. That did come at the cost of a lot of green screen, but I'm able to look past that here when Ragnarok is mostly a sensory delight. I think there's a lot of strong character work, for Thor and Loki especially. I would have liked to have seen more from Valkyrie, Scourge, and Heimdall, although they each get their moments. Even Odin feels well handled in his brief appearance. Doctor Strange is in the movie for like 2 minutes, and it's the most I've ever enjoyed the character. The 2 biggest disappointments are Hulk and Hela, as if Marvel's weird distribution dispute with Hulk hadn't already hamstrung the character. Forcing them to cram an arc for him into the background of these team-up movies, I think they sort of botched that here. I like what they did with Hulk, but Banner and Hulk reaching a new phase of their struggle and turmoil only really serves as a starting point, learning that Hulk has the potential to win out for good. But after thoroughly establishing the cost of Banner becoming Hulk again, they ignore those implications during the big showdown. He ends this movie and starts the next as Hulk. So maybe it was supposed to suggest that he was now stuck like that, but it's never addressed and is undone so quickly that it never matters. And Hela is just severely underwritten. We don't spend a lot of time with her, and they banked really hard on Blanchett carrying things, which she totally did. Maybe they could have reworked her scenes with Scourge to better bring more depth to her character and reveal more about Scourge while we're at it. Kate is great and everything surrounding Hela rocks, but looking and acting cool maybe isn't enough for the 17th MCU installment. The only other major thing that is underwhelming is the destruction of Asgard. Visually, it's another amazing sequence, but it's not one that really seems to affect the average Asgardian, despite it upsetting literally all of their lives forever. You guys have lived in this one place for thousands of years. Do they all accept that this was inevitable? Even so, it feels strange how little time and attention is paid before, during, or after to the titular end of their world. It's the major event in this movie, and it's confusingly ignored and totally underplayed. Any other grievance I have is so minor. The vast majority of this movie works for me. It was fresh, surprising, entertaining, visually unique, and so much more. It has some issues that will hold it from claiming a tip-top spot, but it's among my favorites so far, and it earns a breezy, solid 8 out of 10. It's actually the only movie that hasn't moved in either direction from my previous rating. Good for you, Ragnarok. It deserves all the love it gets, and I can't wait to see what insanity will come from Thor 4. I didn't intend to do this, but now that I'm already too deep, I might as well make all 3 of my interludes into safe horror recommendations. So here, let's talk about Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak, starring Tom Hiddleston. He's not the lead, but still has a major role, so I'm using him as my branching point. I was a late bloomer getting into the genre myself, and want others out there to realize what a wealth of quality filmmaking they're cutting themselves off from by avoiding any and all things horror. And I think watching movies from Del Toro is a great way to invest in the artistry of the genre. Even to this day, when I'm getting too scared in a movie, I find stepping back mentally to appreciate how a scare was orchestrated or a spooky monster was crafted helps me to detach just enough to enjoy the scare rather than being consistently devastated by it. And what better lens to use when looking at the artistry of horror than through a practical master like Del Toro? Trailers for Crimson Peak did it dirty. Everyone went in expecting a raw horror ghost story, and instead got a creepy gothic romance. It has the makings of a modern classic, lifting up the genre that inspired it without a hint of insincerity. The movie can border on cheesy at times, but I think reins it in just enough to never lose its way. That clarity of vision, beautiful production, and memorable performances, with some light scares to keep you on edge, allow Del Toro to fully transport you to and immerse you in this world. Narratively, the movie certainly isn't perfect, but the meticulously crafted visuals and minor details make for a transfixing watch. Maybe it's odd to attach 3 horror-ish films to a review of a Thor trilogy, but I've seen enough comments from viewers over the years to know how common horror avoidance is, and as someone who once did the same, I'd like to chip away at that wall for some others if I can. Someday I might even make a video dedicated to horror gateway experiences, but for now, I hope this short list encourages a few people to step outside that comfort zone. It feels like an awesome milestone to be wrapping this one up. Now having a trilogy of videos on superhero movie trilogies, we're already 9 movies deep. It just feels good. There were some pretty big surprises here. It's not like anything moved dramatically in their relative rankings. Thor 1 and 2 are still low, and 3 is still high. But Ragnarok now eclipses both Iron Man 1 and the first Avenger for me. So while I always enjoyed Ragnarok, I appreciated it more this time around than maybe ever before. It was disappointing to realize how average the first Thor was. I think the bar was just so low back then that making a movie about that character remotely passable felt like it deserved more credit than it maybe actually did. A lot of things worked well in that movie, but it can be so bland and boring at times. It's definitely the weakest of the 3 origin movies, even if it managed to pull together a better third act than either of the other 2. Thor: The Dark World is notably less bad than I remembered, but maybe not quite good. I never hated it as much as so many other people seemed to, but this really confirmed for me that it was a very mishandled movie, with a stronger villain, a trimming of basically everything on Earth, and a greater commitment to Reality Stone weirdness with a touch of cosmic horror, and this movie could have been excellent. Yes, those are very substantial major changes, but most of it was there already. It might be the biggest case of wasted potential of any of these 9 movies so far. There are enough positives counting in favor of this movie that it makes it much easier to see what a good version would, could, or should have been, even if those glimmers of quality are not enough to add up to a movie that stands firmly on its own. And Ragnarok, oh Ragnarok, my sweet baby darling, while lacking in a few key regards that bar it from reaching the top of my rankings, it is far and away the most entertaining of these movies, while also delivering just enough depth to save it from becoming a joke or a complete mockery. It felt necessary to reboot things, and the fact that they were able to execute that shakeup so effectively, moving things as dramatically as they did, balancing so many characters and major events while delivering laughs and cheers in equal quantity and quality is an incredible feat. Its only competition in this modern era for funniest superhero movie is probably Deadpool. I'll review all the X-Men movies someday, don't you worry, way down the line. But Deadpool relies so heavily on the devil's anus approach of smushing dirty words together that I insist Ragnarok is the funnier movie. It ticks off nearly every box except for a underdeveloped Hulk storyline and wasted villain. But I know from personal experience, Ragnarok remains one of the most accessible MCU movies. I think my mom had seen maybe 3 or 4 random installments, and she was still able to enjoy this movie for completely different reasons than me. It's impressive how deeply in this universe this movie is entrenched, but that anyone could walk in and still enjoy it. That's why it was such a massive success. Thor as a character has come so far, and Hemsworth deserves so much credit for his work in these movies, even when they gave him so little to work with. I still remember my surprise when the guy who played Kirk's dad in the Star Trek reboot got cast. It's unbelievable how quickly and effectively these movies can catapult someone's career. Nobody knew Chris Hemsworth, and now the Hemsworth brothers are like a household name. And I love that over a decade later, spanning spanning his entire career thus far, Hemsworth is still willing to stick with this character. He's got a long ways to go to eclipse Jackman's 17 years as Wolverine, but now that Thor has gone through some of the biggest arcs of any Marvel hero, I'd be down to see Thor continue to grow for as long as possible. It was hard to imagine before Thor 1 that a character like this could ever work on screen, let alone when paired off with all these humans. Yet he somehow became one of my favorite characters in the franchise, and I am elated that he is seemingly sticking around for the long haul. I'm rooting for a full-on Taika trilogy, maybe then continuing on to play the character as a wiser, older legacy character, offering up advice without being directly involved like Odin. It would be so awesome to bring him full circle like that. But if his arms keep getting bigger with each movie like this, they're gonna have to start CGI shrinking his biceps for them to even look believable. Holy shit. It's easily the weakest of these three trilogies, yet Thor is the character I'm most excited to see more of. Tony and Cap had great retirements that came at the appropriate time, but after the journey this character has been on, both in his real-world development and in movie trajectory, I think we were left with so much left to tell, and I can't wait to dig into that. It came up briefly a few times in this video, but while working on this monster, the first teaser for Thor 4 finally dropped. And honestly, it's so much of what I wanted it to be. It so clearly still has Taika's influence end to end, but now untethered. You can tell that visually this movie is now doing a new thing like I hoped, and it feels much closer to the style of movie he would normally make. I know the entire movie won't be a character exploration of Thor considering retirement and trying to figure out what he would do after Endgame, but I genuinely wish it was a 2-hour movie of him just kind of figuring himself out, deciding who or what he wants to be. Obviously, there's still a villain and there's gonna be a big showdown, but I don't think we need it. I don't know, I'm very excited for it still. I think it looks great. I think it easily has the potential to be the best Thor movie yet. I'll keep my fingers crossed, we'll see once it finally releases. The next video in this series will cover the Avengers 1 and 2, then I'll put the brakes on the MCU content for just a little bit, and then we can cover the back half of the Infinity Saga in the second half of the year. I knew I had a lot to say about Captain America. I never would have guessed this would have been the longest of these videos yet. Thank you all so much for watching. I know these comic book movie reviews are outside of the norm of what I normally do with the channel, but I have so much fun making them. I have so much fun talking about the movies and characters in the comments, so I'm gonna keep doing it. A big shout out to patrons of the channel. Their additional support means a lot. Be sure to go check out Wendy's channel. There will be a link down below, and I hope to see you all again soon.